Hello, and first, welcome, Orange You. Thank you so much for passing by. I think I'm like almost certain I saw you yesterday in Neuralicia's stream, which shout out to them, which I should do right now. Uh, PhD candidate in neuroscience that we did a collaboration going over some neuroscience research about optogenetics and addiction, which, I'm hoping at some point we can collab again. But obviously, totally up to them. Their choice. They're not obligated to. And Orange Hue, potato, excellent source of carbohydrates for the morning. And you are certainly in a totally different hemisphere if you're like 13.5 hours ahead of me. I think literally pretty much exactly, I don't know, on the totally opposite whatever pole than I am. That's almost the furthest away that you can get from me, I think. Pretty close to it. But either way, thank you so much for passing by. I hope you're enjoying your morning, getting your brain up and running with a good source of carbohydrates like a potato. Yeah, exactly. You're in China or something. You can probably tunnel your way through. But yeah. So I plan to stream. I was going to stream yesterday, Friday, but on Thursday night to be specific, I actually did some in real life, activities. So here in my area, there's a annual comedy festival, the Just for Laughs Festival, in Montreal, and I went to a few comedy shows on Thursday evening. It was great. I saw Ronnie Chang, who is one of the correspondents for The Daily Show, and he had a really great set. I barely, if you squint hard enough, you can see a life outside of Twitch, but it's barely visible. Oh, and Kitty, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. Yeah, and it was totally fun. I think that aside from maybe going to a couple of movies in the past couple years, that might have been since whatever the pandemic, as much as I've been exposed to a crowd, because let's just say it, even though whatever it's overall much safer, I'm still not too keen on large crowds, and I never was keen on large crowds before the pandemic, and now it's just made me much less so. But this seemed totally worth it, and I'm not gonna lie, it felt good to kind of feel that sense of whatever normalcy, whatever that means, or basically these are annual things in my area. We have a jazz festival that was put on hold, and I believe the Just for Laughs festival was put on hold for a while. I think it came back last year, but I definitely wasn't keen on going into a crowd last year. But this year, it seemed some analysis that I can do that, okay, the risk is not super high. And yeah, it was a great time. And so I was out. I only got home at 2 o'clock in the morning. I went to bed around 3 or 4 in the morning. Then I went to the gym on Friday, and then I just didn't really have any energy to really actively engage in the research that I prepared for that day. So I'm here today, got a good night's sleep, and thankfully my sleep is still holding up. If that continues to be the case, I should be able to bring content way more regularly for the next little while, which that is my plan. So on today's stream, I'm actually going to cover some of the content that I wanted to cover on last stream on Wednesday, was it? Because, well, yeah, as usual, I have always way more content prepared than I actually have time to cover. But yeah, there's some pretty cool, at least in my mind, cool Alzheimer's research, or rather specifically in the realm of, potentially screening or diagnosing for Alzheimer's. And I guess I should maybe use the term research, I don't know, loosely in that case, because from what I understand, or as we will see, it's basically, it's not peer-reviewed, published research. At least not yet, doesn't seem to be the case. It was it was data presented at a conference. So, maybe a little bit of an asterisk of whether this actually makes any meaningful difference in the world of Alzheimer's. I guess remains to be seen. But let's just say it is more or less standard practice to present data and results at a conference. It's more or less just unpublished, but generally speaking, there's every intention to publish, or it's going through the peer review process now, and it's just a matter of time before it's published, and so they're presenting it at a conference now. And you are absolutely correct, Orange Hue. Theranos made a lot of claims, and hopefully, hopefully this is more grounded in reality, and also I'm definitely not an Alzheimer's expert. But I think, the claim that you can screen or maybe detect early signs of Alzheimer's from a drop of blood or a blood test, I would say that's way more in the ballpark of realistic, as opposed to we can do virtually everything, every type of screening or diagnosis from a drop of blood. And as we'll see, based off of what's described, again, not an Alzheimer's expert, but based off of the description, it seems realistic and totally feasible, and not travel to Mars type of ambition. And I'm sort of, casually following that superconductor news. It seems basically they're trying to reproduce some of the bold claims. And on that topic, the other thing that I have prepared is pretty much also in the title of what can be done to change or hopefully make better the peer review process. And there's a paper published that presumably went through peer review that kind of pretty much makes a call to change the peer review process. Kind of they point out kind of some fundamental flaws in the process that pretty much everyone has been made aware of. And then they also make some recommendations of hey, maybe how do we move forward? It seems like there's more and more people or more and more researchers extremely unhappy or dissatisfied with the peer review or publication process. But it's as you'll sort of see, it seems like it's kind of a stalemate, since there's multiple moving pieces, and no institution or whatever group of individuals want to make the first move, so everyone's just locked in. It's well, I'll only change if you change, but if I basically no one's willing. It's kind of two people sitting down to play a game of chess, but no one has agreed on who makes the first move, and so nothing happens. And levitating, well, aren't levitating beds essentially water beds? I think those have fallen out of fashion from what I can tell. But water beds were once a thing. That, I guess, well, they did have the sensation of levitating or, floating on water. I think that's pretty close. Alright, so diving right into it. But yeah, understandably, waterbeds I think have fallen way out of fashion. I don't think anybody has a waterbed anymore. But at one time, they were all the rage. Or at least, they were way more of a thing. I would agree with you. Floating on them would be totally fun. My parents had a waterbed, and I totally loved it. It's definitely a really cool, whatever, feeling or sensation. So, this is what I wanted to cover last time, and actually, just today. So this is published, or rather this article describing the research was published July 24th. And then today, this other article came out, just today, about pretty much also in the realm of diagnosis or screening, Like, hey, maybe we can detect it through pretty much like a loss, through a loss of sense of smell. Uh, so, seems like pretty much there's understandably a lot of research devoted to like how can we detect it, screen for it at pretty much at early stages. That's an excellent. So I'll have to plead ignorance. Would it surprise me if that was tried? It would absolutely not surprise me. Because I know that dogs have been, tested out, or there are multiple avenues that people have tried to use dogs for like diagnosis, screening, whatever. Even there was at one time some articles published about using dogs to screen for, or rather to test or screen for COVID infection. I don't think that really ever got off the ground. So, researchers found that finger prick tests may be effective for diagnosing and monitoring Alzheimer's disease remotely. Yeah, I'm starting off of this one because I have other things that I want to briefly cover at some point. But since this has been on the back burner, I'm gonna make sure that I get through this. But sort of maybe as a preview, I sort of showed this last time. Of like maybe even though like it's pretty much universally accepted and the recommendation still holds true that exercise is beneficial, and that if you're able to meet the minimum requirements of exercise, there's a whole host of health benefits, but at the same time maybe we can do better moving forward in terms of like the quality of the research, of like, hey, maybe the recommendations or the foundation of which these recommendations stem from aren't the highest quality of foundations. I mean, we could probably, I think we have the technology now that if we probably couldn't come up with a whole nose, I don't know, but we can probably like, yeah, it's not a ridiculous idea. But I think it probably has to be connected to a brain. It might sound, well, very often the scientific ideas that sound the most ridiculous can very often be like the most like revolutionary. But from what I understand of like whatever canine senses or their canine sense of smell, I think it probably has to be connected to like the canine brain, because I think it's really, the nose, from what I understand, casually, that's like the sensory input. But like the understanding or the processing of that sensory input, like happens in the brain, as in like your eyes are useless, not connected to a brain. You can't do any direct seeing or observation without the processing power of your brain. At least that's how I understand it. Well, that is actually an interesting. Well, so this is, yeah, totally probably at some point in the domain of gene editing. No, you're bringing up like these are all fantastic things. Because like we are almost certainly moving to that place of like gene editing or human gene editing to improve things such as our sense of smell. And so you're not proposing ridiculous things. So yeah, another study found that blood tests deliver over 85% accuracy in Alzheimer's diagnosis, whereas primary care physicians have around 55% accuracy. Blood tests may both increase the accuracy and accessibility of Alzheimer's disease diagnosis and monitoring. And one of like the real hurdles or challenges of Alzheimer's is that, at least from what I understand currently, you can only actually like fully officially confirm diagnosis or actually diagnose it, post-mortem. Unfortunately, after the person has passed away, and like through autopsy. Oh, and iCal, Rich, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. Nice to see you. And also, shout out to iCal Rich. a streamer or content creator in the making. That will be streaming sometime in the future. So I know the jury's still out on plaques and tangles as a cause for Alzheimer's because of the so you are correct that there was fraudulent, exposed fraudulent Alzheimer's research. But the whole tau and tangles, I think is still like the working model. If I remember correctly, like that fraudulent Alzheimer's research did not was, let's say, tangentially related to like the tangles, the taus, and the plaques. But I need to refresh my memory on the topic of Alzheimer's, not to make light of it. Yeah, it was. I mean, I remember reading this exact article. Okay, yeah. So plaques. So you are likely correct in terms of like the plaque formation. But I think this is slightly different. So there's kind of like the tau and tangles. So yeah, it's a little bit I don't know, nuanced of like, yeah, the amyloid plaques, which are like a specific type of kind of like protein misfolding. It looks like that is the one that appeared to have been fraudulent. But then this tau or tangles, I think still is working, or like still appears to hold true. As in like, yeah, a particular vein of Alzheimer's research appears to have been like entirely, if not like majority fraudulent. But let's just say not all is lost. There was still this other avenue that still appears to be holding true in terms of tau and tangles. So major setback for sure, but basically it's not like a full reset of all Alzheimer's research, thankfully. Some background context from Google: an estimated 6.7 million age 65 and older living with Alzheimer's. Yes, exactly. And given that we're living longer and that more people are living to older age, I think the projections are just like more and more people are going to be experiencing somewhere on the spectrum of cognitive decline, like somewhere from like mild cognitive impairment to like dementia, Alzheimer's, etc., etc. Older black Americans are about twice as likely to have Alzheimer's or other dementias as older whites. Older Hispanics are about 1.5 times as likely to have or other dementias as older whites. That, I believe, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, I don't think plaques are holding true. And even then, like, well, the specifically like the amyloid plaques. If I can bring it back up. Which is like a specific type. One second. Yeah, the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's. So that seems like, that was the research that was called into question. So like, basically, Alzheimer's, they appear to fall under the broad category of kind of protein misfolding, condition. And proteins can misfold in multiple ways. And one of them is, as highlighted here, as brought up, sort of like these amyloid plaques. Or like, yeah, the alpha beta clumps known as plaques are like the primary cause of devastating illness. So like that's just like one avenue of basically the misfolding process of proteins. But there's this other avenue that like it's still under the broad category of protein misfolding, but basically through like a different mechanism, or maybe not, protein misfolding and like protein aggregation, without dissecting what exactly that means. But basically, it's like we have various ways to get to like the end point of like protein misfolding and protein aggregation. And then like here are the explanatory mechanisms. One of the mechanisms is like, yeah, the amyloid plaques or the alpha beta clumps. And like that has been severely called into question or basically exposed to be like largely fraudulent. And then the other avenues that are still like being pursued, the tau entangles still appears to be like holding true. So yeah, like not all is lost, or like we're not starting from scratch in terms of like understanding Alzheimer's or like the research to treat it. Yes, so that's my understanding as well of like, yeah, in terms of like the relationship between just your dental health is not only isolated to like your mouth, as it appears to also play a role, as you say, in terms of like dementia, and also like heart disease or cardiovascular disease, of like as you say, plaque getting to the bloodstream, and potentially like causing damage, or even just like blocking blood circulation. Hence the important of like, yeah, no surprise, but I think medicine at one point, at least obviously I don't know the entire history of medicine, but I think there are it's let's say organ systems or organs, or like even just like the departments of medicine. It's like you have your department of cardiology, and it's just like heart health, and just like focusing on the heart, and like not really recognizing that the body's an integrated system, and that like what happens in your mouth like probably affects multiple systems, and that it's not just like whatever's happening in one part of the body is like only isolated like there. There's usually downstream effects because your body is an integrated system. So around 6 million people in the US currently live with Alzheimer's disease. By 2050, this figure is projected to increase to almost 13 million. Which, yeah, not overly surprising, given aging population, and people expected to live longer and longer. While there's currently no cure for Alzheimer's, studies show that early diagnosis and intervention are crucial for delaying its onset. Current diagnostic methods include magnetic resonance imaging, cognitive tests, and physical exams. However, they have restricted accessibility, as they require visiting a clinic with trained personnel and complex delivery and storage procedures or samples. The accuracy of such tests also varies. The study found that around 25% of patients clinically diagnosed with probable Alzheimer's during their lifetime do not have evidence of Alzheimer's at autopsy. Like this is one of the key, from what I understand, one of the key challenges. Like I said, it seems like you can only really accurately diagnose Alzheimer's post-mortem, when you actually, visualize the brain through autopsy. And that, like, yeah, as they're saying here, there's like basically, there's people that are essentially being misdiagnosed or not correctly diagnosed. Research also shows that up to 50% of patients with any form of dementia are not formally diagnosed while alive. So, like, we're also missing diagnoses, essentially. Yeah, exactly. False positives. And maybe even, false negatives. Improving the accuracy and availability of Alzheimer's testing could help physicians diagnose the disease sooner and prescribe interventions to potentially delay disease progression. Recently, researchers designed a method to analyze fingerprint tests for Alzheimer's that can be taken at home without the need for clinician oversight. So it seems like At least, this is at the research phase. This does not appear to be at the clinical level of like, close to being approved by some sort of institution or regulatory body. But it seems like, the end goal or the ultimate goal is like, some at-home testing kit or something that a patient can do at home. And then, maybe the doctor just gets the results and they just, get the results when they get an appointment. Another study found that blood tests can yield over 85% accuracy in detecting Alzheimer's, whereas standard physical examinations deliver accurate diagnoses around 55% of the time. The findings were presented at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference in Amsterdam, Netherlands, and online. So, like, yeah, this is not, as mentioned, a peer-reviewed, published study in an academic journal. Although I'm pretty sure it's probably on the way there to being that, since typically data like this, you don't usually want to share it unless you know it's going to get published, or is like on the way to published. So, for the study, the researchers included 77 memory clinic patients in Barcelona, Spain. All participants provided venous and finger prick blood samples, as well as neuropsychological measures. Blood samples were either spotted and dried on dry blood spot cards or preserved via an anticoagulant called ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid, or EDTA, which is, pretty standard in virtually every biology or molecular biology or biochemistry lab. Cheap reagent. For overnight shipment to the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So, basically, as they say here, a dry blood spot, and this is something that I'm actually pretty familiar with. And I'm going to bring up some research that is, that is pretty much exactly in line with, let's say, my field, and that I have direct experience with, of, like, using dried blood spots to screen for something. Actually, the research that I'm going to show, so they're using dried blood spots here in the hopes of, like, screening or diagnosing for Alzheimer's. And then the research that I'm going to show is pretty much the exact same principle, a dried blood spot, to potentially diagnose COVID infection or like previous COVID infection. Where pretty much, the person is just sent, kind of like a little card, not like a piece of paper card, but like, a specialized card that the person just like provides a drop of blood, and the blood dries up. But things are preserved there on the card, and they can just, like, send it for testing. Whereas EDTA blood samples need to be refrigerated, dried blood spot cards only require shelter from humidity and moisture, making them easier to transport. That's pretty much, like, the major advantage, and why, like, things like this are pursued. It's there's very often the trade-off of, like, yeah, you can get, like, really highly accurate testing, with, let's say, using COVID as the example, the gold standard, a PCR test, where it's like, the greatest accuracy, but that requires longer processing times, a little bit more of an invasive test. It's not just like you spitting on like a stick or whatever. And it's generally like a longer turnaround time as opposed to like, the at-home test now. It's like, 15, 20 minutes and, you wait for pretty much like an at-home pregnancy test. So like, yeah, the take-home tests are like way more convenient, but it's a trade-off of like, they may not be as accurate, or you might be sacrificing some of the accuracy. So, yeah, EDTA samples also require centrifugation, the mechanical separation of fluids according to their density, before they can be examined, whereas, yeah, the dried blood spot does not require this step. Once in Sweden, the researchers tested the blood samples for Alzheimer's-related biomarkers, including neurofilament light, glial fibrillary acidic protein, and phosphorylated tau. So, they're basically screening for proteins from the dried blood spot, or like they're looking for proteins. I mean, there's this one here that's clearly a protein, since it's in the name. Tau should be a protein. And I suspect neurofilament light is also a protein. I'm almost certain. So basically, they're doing like protein screening from a drop of blood. And I'm curious. I don't think they share how they're doing the detection methods. But I'm curious actually how they do it. Of like, what instrument do they use? Because the research that I'm going to show is pretty much like the exact same principle of a dried blood spot, and like from the dried blood spot, they're looking for the spike protein, and they're using a specific detection method to detect the spike protein from the drop of blood. They wrote that this means that Alzheimer's biomarkers can be quantified via finger prick collection, and that dried blood spots could help with regular monitoring of patients with suspected neurological conditions. How accurate are blood tests for Alzheimer's? So in a second study also to be presented at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, Dr. Sebastian, associate professor at Lund University, Sweden, and colleagues compared the efficacy of blood-based biomarkers for detecting Alzheimer's with examinations from primary care physicians. So like it's comparison. How does this compare to, let's say, the more standard practice, or like the more conventional testing methods used now, or diagnosis methods used now? And again, the research that I'm going to show is pretty much the exact same strategy of like, hey, this is potentially a new way. How does it stack up against the conventional or current methods? They included 307 middle-aged to elderly patients with an average age of 76 years. Primary care exams included cognitive testing and a CT or MRI scan. Participants also provided a venous blood sample, which was analyzed to determine concentrations of beta amyloid and phosphorylated tau. Whereas primary care physicians identified Alzheimer's-related changes or correctly diagnosed Alzheimer's 55% of the time, blood tests did so over 85% of the time. Like this potentially new method, or like this method in development, so far appears to outperform the conventional methods. Dr. Palmqvist said in a press release that a lack of accurate diagnostic tools can make it difficult for primary care doctors to identify Alzheimer's. This too often leads to diagnostic uncertainty and inappropriate treatment. Blood tests for Alzheimer's have great potential for improving diagnostic accuracy and proper treatment of people with Alzheimer's. These tests may become even more important in the near future, as new drugs that slow down the disease in its early stages become more widely available. So, a cheaper and quick way to diagnose. We see these new tools improving our ability to recognize the earliest changes of Alzheimer's and ultimately speeding our ability to prevent or delay the onset of memory decline. Dr. Jeffrey Burns, a neurologist and co-director of the University of Kansas Medical Center's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, who was not involved in the study, told Medical News Today. These tools will become available to the public soon. We expect FDA approval of blood measures of Alzheimer's in the next 1 to 2 years. We are entering a new and exciting era of Alzheimer's disease with new diagnostic and treatment approaches that will change how we practice dramatically. I'll be it'd be great if they actually stick to this timeline. I take it with a little bit of grain of salt. I would say probably more on the order of like 2 to 3, maybe 2 to 4. But who knows? Usually, like these things, and to take more time than they claim. Currently, there's a bottleneck where we don't have enough specialty clinicians to do the extensive testing needed to diagnose Alzheimer's. Dr. David Merrill, a psychiatrist and director of the Pacific Neuroscience Institute's Pacific Brain Health Center in Santa Monica, California, who is not involved in the study, told Medical News Today. I really hate, every single title and affiliation is used to describe every single researcher in every paper or article. Radioactive brain scans and lumbar puncture tests are riskier, more expensive, and require specialty medical care. Even the current blood tests need expert processing and handling to not spoil the results, he explained. If this method is validated, it could increase the number of patients screened for Alzheimer's and may help catch the disease early, when interventions can have a greater impact. This is by Dr. Jennifer Brahman, scientist World Medical News Today. A simple finger prick of blood put onto a card that can be shipped directly from a patient's home at room temperature simplifies the process of getting tested for Alzheimer's. So, even though this is potentially a huge leap forward in, screening or diagnosis, why a blood test alone may not be enough. Dr. Brahman noted that a limitation to the findings is that it was a small pilot study, and the research methods and results have not yet been through the peer review process. Right? So like I said, these are data and results that have been presented at a conference, and though it will be published like pretty soon, they're making pretty ambitious claims, and they appear to be essentially going public with it. They're going public with it. There should be a high chance that it's going to get, peer-reviewed and published in an academic journal. Dr. Burns added that detecting amyloid is not the same as Alzheimer's. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit conflicted about reading all the titles of I recognize that, you want to distinguish them from, random strangers, on the street. But then, saying, pretty much putting their entire CV after reading their name, is, really annoying. It will be important to learn how best to apply these tools in broad, real-world clinical practice. Medical News Today also spoke with Dr. Raphael Wald, PsyD. Interesting. I know that there's a little bit of a debate of, let's say, the credibility of a PsyD, of kind of like a PhD light, so to speak. A neuropsychologist at Baptist Health Marcus Neuroscience Institute, who is not involved in the study. He noted that while the test may be useful as corroborative evidence for diagnosing Alzheimer's, it does not indicate the level of impairment a person has. Right. So it may not say something, or maybe one of the fallbacks or drawbacks is you can't really say anything about the level of cognitive decline. Assuming cognitive decline is pretty much on the pathway, or cognitive impairment is on the pathway somewhere on, dementia, Alzheimer's, then maybe just these biomarkers alone. If you actually want to assess, the current state of the patient, and their level of, cognitive processing, maybe the biomarkers are not enough. So yeah, a PsyD is basically, seems like it's it's a doctor of psychology, but then why not just call it a PhD? Or what's the difference between a PhD in psychology and a PsyD? Yeah. There's a continued demand in today's workforce for those with a doctorate in psychology, whether it's a PsyD or a PhD in psychology. What's the difference between? So yeah. So a PsyD or a doctor of psychology, as opposed to doctor of psychology, or PhD in psychology. Philosophy doctorate versus doctor of psychology. But yeah, 1960s as an alternative to PhD psychology programs, typically pursued by individuals interested solely in the hands-on, straightforward practice of psychology without dedicating professional time to research or academia. So, it's essentially, a non-research based PhD, which, at least for many people, maybe myself included, is a little bit of an oxymoron. Of generally speaking, PhD, or what most people understand, or what most academics understand about PhDs, that they're pretty much entirely research focused. So many people, let's say, oh wow, thank you so much. for the sub, Boy Meets Mini, and also shout out to you. Super appreciate it. And also looking forward to your return to streaming. But yeah, everyone, if you're not following Boy Meets Mini, everybody should be. They do great content. Actual racing and going over critical racing theory. And of course, a host of other games. Yeah. I remember seeing that. Is it like a new season? Or just, you know, back to, you know, racing for fun? That's all. Obviously, hopefully all games that you play are for fun. But basically, in a non-competitive setting, or it's just like a new season, or I don't know how it works. Okay, gotcha. Oh, good. I'm gonna do my best to tune in. Let's see. So hopefully, like, you know, this is just my casual opinion. But and also at the same time, you know, you got to balance it with, you know, if anyone's looking for a psychologist or access to a therapist, sometimes you just got to go with what you have access to. At least I can say within my area. There's definitely a huge shortage of mental health professionals. Well, pretty much there's a shortage of any health professionals in my area. And so yeah, I would personally, this is just my opinion, like if you can get access to a psychologist or therapist that has a PhD, I think that's probably a little bit more the optimal route. But if you only have the option of a PsyD, gotta go with what you got. That's, you know, better than nothing, especially if like you're in need. And this is absolutely not to like denigrate or like downplay necessarily a PsyD and the credential. I think there's, let's say, you know, some valid questions to be grappled with when it comes to the credentials of a PsyD. But yeah, I guess a separate tangent. So, where was I? The level impairment. So, meanwhile, Dr. Merrill said that while blood tests may be more accurate than taking medical histories alone, clinicians must also consider what care comes afterward. Will there be ready access to confirmatory testing? How often can or should the test be repeated, and who will pay for it? Will blood spot testing be accepted for beginning treatments, or will more tests be required? What support will be in place for newly diagnosed patients? The diagnosis of Alzheimer's can be a devastating moment. There's a lot of details to work through before offering this test to the general public, he concluded. So, you know, if this in fact, as they say, gets approved, either in the 1 to 2 years that they say, or let's say 2 to 4, seems like a pretty big step forward in diagnosing and screening. And I'm also curious, or I will be curious, if in fact it gets published. You know, how are they actually, like, what are they using to do the testing, or like what instrumentation? Because, you know, let's just say, you know, proteins and protein detection, kind of like a specialty of mine, or like, you know, an area of expertise of mine. And so, like, yeah, with that Alzheimer's research that they reported at the conference, they're basically using a dried blood spot to look for biomarkers that are potentially signs of either Alzheimer's or early Alzheimer's, or, you know, somewhere on the path to Alzheimer's. So as you can see here in this abstract of this research, they literally use pretty much the same exact thing, dried blood spots, but it's a different application. So this is cross-validation of ELISA and a portable surface plasmon resonance instrument for IgG antibody serology with SARS-CoV-2 positive individual. Okay, so like, what does that, you know, this is fancy, you know, technical terminology, and, you know, whatever, biochemistry or analytical chemistry. But the overall principle is the same as like what we just covered with that Alzheimer's research, where okay, they have this new method or potentially new method, and they compared it to the conventional methods or the conventional screening methods, and so in principle, that is what that's what is being done here. They're comparing. That's why they say it's a cross validation. And ELISA, so that's one particular technique. That is essentially, arguably one of the gold standards or like the conventional methods of like, hey, you want to assess the antibody levels in people previously infected with SARS-CoV-2. And so ELISA is the conventional way that we are doing it or have done it. Although this was published in, 2021. So, this is basically when there was this large push to develop basically the best test or the most robust test for either detecting current infection of SARS-CoV-2 or those previously infected. So this falls in the vein of previous infection or trying to assess antibody levels of like, hey, if you've had a prior infection, how many circulating antibodies do you have? Specifically, these types of antibodies, the IgG antibodies. And so, the popular method, and this method is like, fairly old, and it's been pretty much widely used throughout molecular biology and whatever biochemistry. Like this is kind of like a gold standard that has a variety of applications. And this ELISA stands for something specific. Enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And it takes place, or it's usually done in these these plates like this that have many wells. And it's basically like a color development assay. And it's what we call, say, an enzyme immunoassay. But I'm not going to break down the entire technique. All you really need to know is that it's a conventional technique that has been around for a long time, and it's used for a variety of detection methods. And in this case, since it's been around for a long time, and it's been used to detect other things prior to the pandemic, so it was only, let's say, natural, or it's pretty much like the most obvious application of this, of like, hey, since we used ELISA to detect a whole host of other things prior to the pandemic, and it's still used today for a whole host of other things, and so they used it here, or like that was like the first method development. But then there are understandable drawbacks to using the technique, where if you know about it, or if you have any experience with it, it's pretty time consuming. It requires, like, generally speaking, a specialized technician that knows how to carry out, all the steps. You can kind of think of it of, a lab technician that is, trained to do a specific thing, unlike, a chef that's trained to, cook or prepare a specific dish. As in, there, some training, or there's like a barrier to entry. It's not just like anybody can do it. Well, if you had fun doing an ELISA, so I've definitely, I've done an ELISA, and I've taught ELISAs to many students, because, we teach it to undergrad students, in our biochem courses. I don't think they're particularly fun, personally. They're definitely not fun if you only have access to a single channel, micropipetter. Regardless, if someone finds them fun, by all means, that's not a bad thing. What I can say is I never had fun doing an ELISA. I think they're very tedious. But basically, it's a long and tedious technique carry out that, generally speaking, requires some sort of training to do. And so if you're trying to process, but one of its key advantages is you can process many samples at a time. It's what the scientific world what's termed as a high throughput, or like, generally speaking, high throughput technique. Of like, yeah, if you have, in the context of SARS-CoV-2, if you have like, 10, 20 samples, you can test them all in one batch. And so it's like, yeah, it's like a little bit of a trade-off of like, yeah, it takes quite a bit of time to carry it out and takes, some technical training and expertise, but you're processing a lot of samples at once. So there's that positive. And it also appears to have a pretty good sensitivity and specificity without like breaking down what those are. But all that to say, it's a pretty robust and good technique, but it has its drawbacks. And some of its drawbacks are, pretty strong drawbacks. So in this research here, it's basically trying to develop a new method that, basically addresses some of those drawbacks, or maybe has other advantages. Or rather, depending on the context of like, hey, because as I said, for ELISA, the conventional method, you can process many samples at once, dozens of samples at once, but you don't always want to do that. It's not always convenient or even recommended that, process dozens of samples at once. Sometimes you really are only interested in one sample. It actually does happen, kind of like in a clinical setting, of like, hey, I just have this one sample, and like I'm gonna carry out this entire technique just for this one sample, that potentially costs quite a bit of money to carry out. So you're like wasting quite a bit of money if you don't actually have a lot of samples to process. And so that's where other methods come in of like, yeah, you might not be able to process as many samples, but they may be way more convenient. They might be more accessible. They might require much less processing time. And that's essentially what this is, or what, this research is involved with. Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. I'm like, yeah, if you got experience with ELISA, like that is, like, even though I don't like them, I'm glad that I have experience with it, and I know how to do it, I know how to teach it. But like, I would never take a job, unless I had no other choice. But I would never voluntarily take a job, to like run ELISAs all day. Sounds like a nightmare, to be honest, or like close to a nightmare. So this, the principle here was to like come up with something more convenient. That is, more accessible and not require as much training to carry out in terms of testing. And this is like using dried blood spots. So we report on the development of a surface plasmon resonance sensors. And this is pretty much, I have a lot of experience with this particular technique. I talk about it pretty regularly on stream, because like so I'm bringing up this research for a variety of reasons. One is because, I would say directly relates to the Alzheimer's research that I just went through. And two, it involves SPR, which I have extensive experience with. And also, like, just to be transparent, the instrument used here, okay, it's coming from a company, a specific company, a company that I used to work for, I no longer work for. And this is in the financial disclosures, the conflict of interest, where they say, yeah, I was not directly involved in this research. I'm just saying, like, I used to work for this company. But the other actual researchers that were involved in the research, like, there's financial interest there. Where it's like, yeah, they have an interest in affinity instruments, and they're the ones that make this portable surface plasmon resonance instrument. It's this specific person here, I can highlight, and this specific person here, I can highlight, and yeah, this person here. Uh, I'd love to have a job doing tedious lab work. So that's it. I have no problem, actually. I think we're on the same page. I don't mind doing tedious lab work. I'm not opposed to tedious lab work. It's just like some tedious lab work I enjoy, some that I don't. And I would enjoy doing some tedious lab work for, maybe not 10 hours a day, but I think 7 to 8. Uh, assuming I'm decently compensated. It just so happens that positions like those are not decently compensated, or like they're not. Yeah, I would say they're poorly compensated. But yeah, so like in this research, they're using a specific instrument that they're hoping is better than this ELISA technique, or at the very least is equivalent. Of like, it can pretty much go toe to toe with the conventional current testing methods, but it might have the advantage of like you can just use a dried blood spot, where like pretty much the patient, or rather, there's the convenience of just like sending something to the patient. They provide the sample, and like they can mail it to like a clinic or testing center, and they pretty much do all the work. So yeah, we report on the development of surface plasmon resonance sensors and matching ELISAs for the detection of nucleocapsid and spike antibodies specific against the novel coronavirus 2019, SARS-CoV-2, in human serum, plasma, and dried blood spots. When exposed to SARS-CoV-2 or a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, the immune system responds by expressing antibodies at levels that can be detected and monitored to identify the fraction of the population potentially immunized against SARS-CoV-2 and support efforts to deploy a vaccine strategically. An SPR sensor coated with a peptide monolayer and functionalized with various sources of SARS-CoV-2 recombinant proteins expressed in different cell lines detected in human anti-SARS-CoV-2 IgG antibodies in clinical samples. Like, there's obviously a lot of technical jargon here that I'm going to do my best to break down. That is my understanding as well, at least in, let's say, the United States. Funny that I get more American news crosses my newsfeed than Canadian. But like, yeah, that's my understanding. I don't think it's like fully confirmed. Let's say there's expressions of concern. I think based off of like wastewater monitoring, and I think even if I remember correctly, like hospitalizations, etc., etc. That there's potentially a summer wave that probably will not be as devastating as what we saw as like the worst, but still something to like pay attention to. But yeah, I'm sort of monitoring that situation. Although I should probably monitor it way more closely, to be honest. Yeah, and that is almost certainly, at least my opinion. I would really recommend that. Although I will say and be transparent that when I went to the comedy shows on Thursday, 2 days ago, where I was in pretty large crowds, I was not wearing a mask. And totally, I wanted to, but I'll be transparent of like, I caved to the social pressure. Or like, basically since everyone else wasn't wearing, if you choose to wear one, you are the outlier, right? The mob mentality. I will admit, in that instance, I did cave to the mob mentality. I usually am pretty good at resisting it. It's like, yeah, obviously, mob mentality not a good thing. But like, at a comedy show, at an international comedy show, where you have a mix of Canadians and Americans, and there totally was, let's say, there totally was from what I can tell, based off of some of the cheering in the audience, some conservative Americans in attendance in some of the comedy shows that I attended. I don't. Hey, but you can. I will take that L. For sure, and that's where it's like so tricky. And maybe I can be a better person. Or maybe that's a room for improvement for me. For sure. I can admit that. Where it's like, and I probably could have got like, would actually anybody have called me out on wearing like a surgical mask? Probably not in reality, although I don't actually know. But then like if I wore like a full N95 or KN95, that is say a little bit more extreme of a mask. When like I'm literally like the only one in a sea of like 1,000. On paper, it shouldn't be a problem. And like I agree, in principle and on paper, isn't actually a problem. And like yeah, it's interesting. Psychologically, because like I don't really care about social convention or like fitting in. I don't even choose my clothes that way. I just choose whatever I happen to wear. But arguably, the cat t-shirts that I wear, I think are less politically charged, or less politically and socially charged than like a surgical mask in this context. So you play Plague Tale. Is that one of those basically plague games? Where it's like a pandemic game of like trying to prevent the pandemic? Well, so I'm still planning to do my stream. Like it's gonna come up in the next couple weeks. I'm preparing it of like, the scientific case, the research proving that cats are better than dogs. This is not to say that dogs are bad or that I don't like dogs, but just presenting all the evidence to make it clear that cats overall are better than dogs. And that, we have, let's say, an evolutionary history, or rather, arguably, people think that dogs are man's best friend, and that, cats don't form actual attachments to humans. I think there is actually quite a bit of evidence to show that cats actually do form attachments to humans that are, just as powerful as dogs. I read a sci-fi book where there were electronic filters inside their nostrils and nose did the job of mask. So yeah, that'd be fantastic. Ideally, I would like to get to a place where there's not a concern for like a mob mentality, or like even though it's slim chance, but like basically I'd like to get to a place where there's no chance that you'll be called out for wearing a mask. But that might be a pipe dream or unrealistic expectations. Hey, I'm all for tiny force fields. Okay, so what does this mean? An SPR sensor coated with a peptide monolayer and functionalized with various sources. Okay. And here is where, so I'm going to try and do this with like a makeshift diagram. But I think I'm now committed to buying a tablet with a pen so that I can actually start drawing things. Because otherwise, it's going to get real messy if things get more complicated. So yeah, just to like highlight this, what was done. So they're basically, what they're essentially saying with all their technical jargon is they're making a sensor. Okay, and how are they making their sensor? They're putting SARS proteins on the surface. And here we're gonna really see the limits of my dexterity. I shouldn't even use that. This is sort of my makeshift goal, because they're so. It literally is called surface plasmon resonance, because it literally is a surface. It's a surface composed of gold, or typically gold. I'm not gonna get into all the physics, for multiple reasons. One of them is I'm definitely not qualified to talk about all the physics about surface plasmon resonance. But yeah, it's essentially, it literally is a surface. And what makes it able to sense is you stick things on the surface. As in, oh. So there's various ways of sticking things on the surface. Through basically chemistry, but there's other ways of doing it too. But basically, we have ways of putting things on the surface or attaching things to the gold surface. And that's what they say when they talk about functionalized. So they're functionalizing it with various sources of SARS-CoV-2 stuff. So my way of depicting SARS-CoV-2 stuff and how they're sticking it on the surface, it's literally, I should probably change color. Red probably seems more suited. You can kind of think of that, of the red circles, of they're literally kind of they're attaching them to the surface of hey, this is the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, or this is potentially the SARS-CoV-2 nucleocapsid protein. Those are essentially the two major proteins that are used in, let's say, COVID detection, or let's say COVID research, or detection research. So why are they sticking to the surface? Or what potential application does this have? So if you have, let's say, for example, if one of these, or if these are all the spike protein, ideally these should be all identical, because they should all represent the exact same protein. But if you have all spike protein on the surface, okay, and what you do with this technique, okay, is in this case, what they're doing is they are taking essentially human serum, or it's derived from the dried blood spot. You flow over pretty much in liquid form or solution form, basically your sample, either your human serum or your processed dried blood spot that contains the stuff from the patient. And so what they're doing in this research is they're trying to test, as highlighted in the title, for IgG antibody serology, or essentially fancy terminology for the detection of antibodies in the patient. As in, does the patient have anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies circulating in their blood? That would either be an indication of potentially prior infection or vaccination or both. And so if you pass over the human serum, and let's say that the patient that has provided this human serum, they have actually been infected with SARS-CoV-2, or they've received the vaccination, or both, well, then they should presumably, assuming a normal and healthy immune response, they should develop antibodies as a result of the vaccination or the infection. There's a little bit of distinction to make of if you've been if you received a vaccine, more specifically the mRNA vaccine, or the mRNA-based vaccines, the Pfizer BioNTech, I think virtually everyone knows that basically provides the instructions to code for the spike protein, and then through you making your body the spike protein, you mount an immune response. But you'll mount an immune response specific to the spike protein, because that's all that is available. And so then you'd have these circulating antibodies in your body that is directed against spike protein. So then if you, extract the serum from this person, and, the serum should contain these anti-spike antibodies, And if you flow it over this surface that is now coated with spike protein, then the antibodies should bind to them. And how do we typically depict antibodies? Let's see. It's going to be like really bad. But antibodies, I should probably change color to black. And probably a thicker line. This is now really encouraging me. Antibodies typically have, a Y-shaped, or let's say, generally speaking, depicted as having a Y-shaped structure. And so basically what will happen is, if you have your surface with the spike proteins and then you provided the human serum or the processed dried blood spot from the person that has these antibodies, well, then the antibodies will bind to that spike protein because that's what the person is producing as a result of their immune response. And it's that binding, that interaction that generates basically a signal in the technique, where pretty much the principle of the technique, or what it's largely used for, is to detect interactions. As in, if there is an interaction between two proteins, and in this case, you have the spike protein, and in this case, you have the antibody. Antibodies are proteins. It's what we would call a protein-protein interaction. So if they interact, you generate a signal in, the readout of your software that this instrument will be hooked up to. So that's the overall principle of what they're doing, of their setup, where, an SPR sensor coated with a peptide monolayer and functionalized with various sources of SARS-CoV-2 recombinant proteins. Fancy way of saying, we've got our gold surface and we're putting SARS-CoV-2 proteins down on it. And then they detected anti-SARS-CoV-2 IgG antibodies in clinical samples. So it would be, as I say, like human serum or either from the dried blood spot. And then a nucleocapsid expressed in different cell lines did not significantly change the sensitivity of the assays, whereas the use of blah, blah, blah. Not relevant, what I want to say, or what I want to cover. So yeah, this bioassay was performed on a portable SPR instrument capable of measuring 4 biological samples within 30 minutes of sample sensor contact, and the chip could be regenerated at least 9 times. So what they're saying is basically, the processing time, or how many samples can you process in, a particular window of time. And they're basically saying, for every half hour, you can process 4 biological samples. And they're saying they're mentioning regeneration. And that's sort of like a specific term of it basically. So I guess the best analogy is basically reusability. So if anybody has done one of those, rapid antigen tests, those take-home rapid antigen tests for SARS-CoV-2, they're basically single use only. And so what they're saying here is you basically get multiple uses out of it. For each surface that they make, they can basically reuse it 9 times. So basically 4 samples within 30 minutes. And then after you've run these 4 samples, you can regenerate, basically make it fresh. The analogy would be you can press the reset button on your rapid antigen test and reuse it again. So they're basically saying it has a reusability, or each surface that they make has a reusability of 9 times. So essentially, kind of like in total, presumably, 9 times 4, 36. Total you hypothetically could process, 36 samples, but in batches of 4 that take 30 minutes. So multi-site validation was then performed with the in-house and commercial ELISA. Now, they've kind of they did a proof of principle of does this technique, or this potentially new technique, actually work? Seems like the answer is yes. And then from there, well, then the next question is, how does it compare to the current techniques. And that's why they're bringing out this ELISA. That's like the conventional, the more known, the more popular, that, that's been in use for decades for a variety of purposes. So they're basically just seeing how it stacks up, what we currently have. So, which revealed excellent cross-correlations with Pearson's coefficients exceeding 0.58 in all cases for measurements in dried blood spots and plasma. So this strategy paves the way to point-of-care and rapid testing for antibodies in the context of viral infection and vaccine efficacy monitoring. So, this is pretty much the ultimate, essentially their ambition. Because, as mentioned, ELISA, essentially the gold standard, very robust, really great specificity, accuracy and specificity. But as mentioned, there's processing time, a fair amount of processing time, and requires some specialized training for a person to carry out testing. But as opposed to what they're describing here with their particular instrument, or I guess my former company's instrument, it's like this is portable. As in you hypothetically could do this on site, for conventional testing. The best example is when PCR testing for SARS-CoV-2 was a thing. You pretty much you got your swabs done, and then those were sent to a lab and were processed, and you got the results. So pretty much the testing wasn't performed on site, or using their terminology, at the point of care. There is a lag time where you're not getting your results in real time, or at least there's a much longer turnaround time. What they're trying to develop here, it's you might not be able to process as many samples as, let's say, ELISA, but it's a pretty quick turnaround time, and you might be able to get results basically on site, as in pretty much going to your doctor, getting tested, and getting the potential treatment all in one appointment, as opposed to go to your doctor, ask for a test, wait for that test to get carried out, get the results, and then potentially get treatment. The potential advantage, major advantage, is this can pretty much all of the steps can be done in a fairly short amount of time, of both testing, or rather getting the testing samples, the actual testing, and the results, and then presumably the treatment, kind of potentially all in one appointment, or all in one facility, or potentially at your doctor's office. Because the ultimate end goal is point of care, and that's why they highlight portable. It's not they're using a device that is not super large, essentially in laptop form, even smaller than that. So yeah, basically, I'm highlighting this to show multiple things. Where in the Alzheimer's research that I covered, they use dried blood spots. For the Alzheimer's research, they're really trying to improve screening and diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and pretty much that's essentially what they're trying to do here. Where not universally improve, SARS-CoV-2 antibody screening, but rather pretty much to address an unmet need of hey, there's almost certainly a need for quick, rapid testing that's accurate and convenient, that requires minimal processing. And yeah, this is basically the foundation of that. And again, just as the Alzheimer's research, they use dried blood spots. This research, published in 2021, they also literally use dried blood spots. And so it's literally the exact same strategy of hey, can we get good quality information, potentially diagnostic information, from a drop of blood that is easy for the patient to provide, where they can potentially provide it at home. Send them a card, and they provide a drop of blood on the card, and like they mail it to like a facility. So that's why I highlighted it. And yeah, I'm not gonna go through, not this, but yeah, just to again highlight the fact that, you know, Alzheimer's screening diagnosis, there's a huge unmet need. And that's why, you know, there appears to be more and more articles of, like, just in the span of a week. This article about the research published July 24th, and then this was published just today, of like testing through sense of smell, published today. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover for, you know, the longest time, going back 2 streams ago. So I wanted to make it a point that I actually cover it. Glad I did. So the next thing that I want to cover, second topic in my stream title, is
welcome to Flavor Country.
Oh, and Rosalind, thank you so much for the follow. Much appreciated. Happy to have you here. Hope you're doing well. Oh, and Sir Leviticus, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. Nice to see you. I also hope you're doing well. So, yeah, in my stream title, improving or reforming the peer review process. I've been doing well. Thank you so much for asking. Like, my sleep is holding up, which I'm really glad that's the case, because it's allowing me to stream more. So yeah, for the past, and I mentioned that on Thursday, I went to a comedy show, or I actually went to multiple comedy shows, and that was like a great time. So let's just say this past week has actually been quite good, and I'm optimistic that pretty much, hopefully for the foreseeable future, my sleep holds up. But I pretty much, I never bank on my sleep being super high quality. Just want to actually, okay, I know you're joking, but I'm gonna take it seriously. We have a whole comedy festival. I know you're yanking my chain, but like, so this is basically like, we have the biggest, you know, comedy festival in, like, I think all of the world, if not like North America. Like, we have this domain name. It's called the Just for Laughs Festival. And it's like, literally, you know, if you go to ha.com, it brings you to this. Probably it's like just about every comic. I went to see Ronnie Chang. But yeah, there's basically, it's, as the term implies, it's a comedy festival. There's lots of comedy all over the place. But yeah, I want to address this, or rather want to answer your question. So they are using ELISA to quantify IgG. So, I mean, they are doing that in other publications, but the specific publication that I covered, let me just bring it up. So this is what I just went through. So, like, yeah, not necessarily vaccine efficacy, but to assess antibody levels, or the presence specifically of IgG antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, or individuals with essentially prior infection. But for this specific research, it's comparison. So, like, ELISA is the gold standard, and they're trying to develop a new method, a portable SPR instrument that has some advantages over ELISA, or they hope has some advantages over ELISA, that might make it more convenient, as highlighted here, for like point of care rapid testing for antibodies. Either antibodies as a result of previous viral infection, or as a result of, you know, receiving the vaccine. So, like, yeah, you know, pretty much ELISA is already used, essentially the gold standard. And then here for this research, although this research is published in 2021, and I can, well, actually not going to say anything further because whatever. Even though I no longer work for the company, I'll treat it as still like a conflict of interest. But like, yeah, they're trying to basically develop a new method that is comparable or better than ELISA for the detection of antibodies against SARS-CoV, IgG antibodies. 1 second. But I think I'm sure Russell Peters probably has a show. Yeah, so I know Ronnie from The Daily Show as a correspondent. I've only seen clips of his comedy, but I had never seen a full comedy routine of Ronnie Chang. So I just saw that on Thursday, and it was great. You know, he had like a whole 10-minute section, or I guess bit, I should say, kind of like basically making fun of baby boomers and how baby boomers, you know, ruined a bunch of things, from, you know, the economy to the climate, and how baby boomers are essentially not adapted for the internet, or the internet was clearly not made for them, or made with them in mind, and how, you know, they're just like susceptible to, you know, misinformation and disinformation, and like, yeah, just, you know, the boomers don't have the tools to like navigate the internet space, as opposed to like, not that millennials or Gen Z can perfectly navigate the internet space, or spaces, but I think they are much better overall in general than baby boomers. Oh yeah, all that to say, Canada has comedy, and I think Canada has like the biggest comedy festival in like all the world, if not like in North America. It is the Just for Laughs Festival. Okay. So, I'm going to cover this, replacing academic journals, and, you know, maybe how can we reform the peer review process, or the scientific publication process. But before that, you know, I want to maybe highlight of like, you know, why does there appear to be an ever-increasing call to reform or change the peer review or publication process? There's multiple reasons, okay? This is one of them. Let me just catch up with the chat. Ronnie is funny. 1 second. Sorry. Hey, yeah, so I recommend, Montreal in the summer, I think, is like pretty much like one of the best, if not the best cities. Maybe not the world, but I think in North America, we have lots of festivals in the summer, or rather we have lots of festivals returning. The Jazz Festival was understandably put on hold. I believe the Just for Laughs Festival was also put on hold for a couple years, you know, that is now back. So it's like, yeah, I would recommend checking it out. Okay, how does that translate to the blood thing? Probably missed the context of the question. And yeah, Ronnie, like, he exceeded my expectations. I'll be quite honest with you, I think baby boomers get a really bad rap. I don't think the baby boomer. So I can, so, you know, I am the product, as an older millennial, I'm essentially the product of, you know, the baby boomer generation. But what I would respond with is, I think millennials, and you say you're millennial, I think millennials have also, and Ronnie, during his bit, pretty much, he has a whole bit about millennials and how basically, you know, they were unfairly, demonized or villainized, of like, you know, all millennials are lazy, and that, you know, they just like do nothing, But then he contrasts it with, the baby boomers, whatever, all of the, economic collapse and whatever, all the environmental damage, where he says, like, yeah, in comparison, all millennials have done is, like, they learn how to, take selfies. Doesn't seem so bad. Where I think, I'm biased as an older millennial, but I think millennials are unfairly villainized, personally. So yeah, one of the reasons why there's ever-increasing calls, yeah, like, I don't think, I have no data to back it up. I don't think millennials, I think it's fair to say, and I think I have some research to back it up, of, like, the notion that, like, millennials are just, like, inherently lazy, I think just not true. But, like, yeah, I don't think we have any hard data kind of, like, comparing generations, except for maybe, like, whatever, there's some research showing potentially increases in narcissism over time. Okay, yeah, I want to cover this. Retractions. So, this came out, I think, in the past week or so. Although, this website, Retraction Watch, as the term implies, they basically, well, they're devoted to looking for retractions. They obviously don't catch everything, but they basically, they devote resources to, exposing retractions or calling attention to retractions, and essentially highlighting, poor quality or fraudulent science. And from what I understand, this is essentially like an independent, not-for-profit organization. That's, a group of people have taken it upon themselves to, like, hey, we want to essentially expose bad or fraudulent science. And I use this website pretty heavily, and it seems like a pretty good quality website. I would actually recommend just about everyone follow. So, Sage retracting 36 articles for compromised peer review. Sage Publishing is retracting 37 articles from an engineering journal after finding indicators of third-party involvement in the peer review process. Essentially, the peer review process did not go as intended, or how it should be. The publisher's investigation continues, and more papers may be retracted, a spokesperson for the company told Retraction Watch. A single retraction notice lists the links of the 37 papers to be retracted from Proceedings of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and I actually have that link. Not this one, but this one. So yeah, it's the Sage Journals. This is published, just over a week ago, or exactly a week ago, of like 37, at the request of Sage Publishing and the journal editors. The following articles have been retracted. They list, pretty much all 37. After an internal investigation, Sage became aware that the peer review process for these articles had been compromised and contains indicators of third-party involvement, as these were accepted because of a peer review process that did not meet Sage's expectations of high quality and ethical peer review. The publisher cannot uphold the integrity of the research. In line with COPE guidelines and Sage policies, these articles are retracted. The authors have been informed of this decision using the email addresses provided at submission. People say that kind of stuff. No, yeah. Was it many authors? So that's an excellent question. I, haven't looked at all 37 of these links, but there's probably some commonalities. But it looks like at least of like the first two, not appeared to be any overlap as far as I can tell. But there probably is like, researchers reappearing in multiple publications. But basically, I don't think this can be pinned down on like one particular or like even a small group of researchers. But it's totally a valid question. Yeah, well, I read this from the original website. Oi Kim Tao, the journal's editor-in-chief and associate provo at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, has not responded to our request for comment. Oh, and also, going back to Comedy Fest and Ronnie Chang. Ronnie Chang also has a whole bit on Singapore and, how strict they are. And basically, if you go to Singapore, you're going to die. Essentially, his bit in a nutshell. Only one of the papers, well, you're going to die due to their strict laws. Only one of the papers has attracted notice on PubPeer. In June of last year, sleuth Alexander Magizanov commented that applications of fractional derivatives, basically this paper, contained a hollow sentence with a bulk citation to the benefit of a certain YM truth. That doesn't surprise me. I'm not going to pretend like I have a lot of in-depth knowledge about Singapore. I only know by what I read. I've never been there. But let's just say I have, despite people telling me that there's, due to their strict laws, there's, no pollution, no graffiti, and that it's a very clean city. I have no desire to visit Singapore. Earlier this year, Sage became aware of concerns with the journal's content after one article showed indicators of third-party activity and compromised peer review, a spokesperson said. The publisher began an investigation and reviewed all submissions that showed indicators of suspicious activity. We asked which article tipped off the investigation, but Sage was not able to share the title by our deadline. The spokesperson said, this is a spokesperson from the journal, or rather like the company that owns the journal. Pretty much, as we'll see, when it comes to like scientific publication, it's essentially, an oligopoly, or it's like, pretty much like 3 or 4 companies that essentially control all of scientific publication. Sage is deeply committed to research integrity and writing the academic record. We have recently expanded our research integrity group and have a full dedicated team who are actively working to guard against ethical misconduct, strengthening our use of tools and technology to uncover suspicious activity in papers, improving policies, and identifying journals where there may be similar issues. As a result, we anticipate further retractions to come as we uncover and address potential misconduct. But, maybe this is just like the start of even more retractions. Already 37, there might be even more coming in the pipeline. We will continue to support our editors and assistant editors in peer review best practices, and we have provided them with additional guidance on how to identify suspicious activity in journal submission. Sage was one of the first publishers to recognize large-scale peer review manipulation and begin retracting papers in bulk 9 years ago. We wrote back in 2014 that a batch of 60 retractions involved in a peer review and citation ring deserves a wow. In recent years, however, publishers have been retracting even more papers at once for similar reasons. We asked the Sage spokesperson what's changed since 2014 and if the systems put in place to catch such problems needed updating. The response: since then, we've increased our investment in correcting the academic record and the sign of those efforts. I recently put together a full team whose main purpose is to investigate these issues using new technology to help them along the way and to improve policies and processes for the future. We have more than 1,100 journals, so this can take time, but we are very committed. Other publishers have long had such teams, some for well over a decade. So, it seems like, as a result of, this company that's in charge of many journals, or rather like over 1,000 journals, they, invested, or rather they put greater investment in, let's say, a team that, as they say, supposed to investigate kind of like poor peer review, or, a lack of rigorous peer review process. We're trying to, weed out or expose, poor quality research, or, scientific publications. And it seems like as a result of that greater investment, maybe, more and more is being exposed. So, I guess one could make the argument that that is like a good thing, of like, even though it seems like this is coming way after the fact, I think some of these papers that they're retracting are pretty old, or rather, it's not like in like the last month. Let's take a look at one of them. So this is 2 years old. Okay. Another 2 years old. Obviously not going to click all of them, just a few. This is a year old, and then maybe further down. Yeah, a couple years old. So, like, they're basically, doing a retrospective. Yeah, exactly. They're basically saying, like, yeah, we've invested more, and now we're basically, like, going back and, like, trying to correct, basically, the bad stuff that took place, in the past couple of years. I highly doubt they're going to do, like, a full audit of, their entire, publication history, because, I'm sure that's, like, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, of articles. Yeah, exactly. But, typical... This is like just corporate PR, right? It's like, hey, we're doing a good job. They did not meet the standards or expectations of high quality and ethical peer review. We caught it. Whatever, 1 or 2 years later. And so like now they're being retracted. This is one of the reasons why I'm gonna go through this. That was published just like over a month ago, a little over a month ago, June 2023. Replacing academic journals. This is published in the Royal Society, Open Science. And, you have a group of researchers here, largely based or exclusively based in Europe, or like Europe, whatever, Scandinavia. You have, so you have the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, fairly like world-renowned research institution, and a whole bunch of other research institutions from this group of, and they basically give a breakdown, or rather, they highlight what they consider, and I'm in agreement with them, but what they considered like the fundamental flaws of the peer review or publication system, and explaining, why it's bad. And oh, I don't know if people can hear that, but it sounds like there's, I don't know, fireworks going on. Looks like it's over, but it sounded like fireworks. But yeah, they highlight some. So also, we have in the summer, we literally have a fireworks festival, where like pretty much for like the span of like, I don't know, 2 weeks or a month, there's like fireworks every few days. It's literally a fireworks competition. Although I don't necessarily, it's very cool, and like it's amazing and visually stunning. But I don't necessarily advocate for it, because like it's just like so wasteful and does like a lot of damage. There's a lot of whatever fireworks fallout in the environment. But as a visual spectacle, it is super cool. But yeah, so pretty much they highlight the flaws in the system, and then they make recommendations. We're gonna go through it. So starting off with, a vicious cycle. So they're pretty much going to explain as to why, like, the system is the way it is, and why, like, for the calls to change the system go back decades, but nothing seems to ever change. So, like, it seems like things are locked in. Like, this is the system. Nobody likes the system, but the system is not changing. Like, why is it not changing? After 3 decades of deterioration, more and more experts consider the scholarly journal system fundamentally broken, and demand that it be replaced. And also, I want to say, even though, like I highlighted, you know, a lot of these retractions. And, you know, uh, I regularly cover, you know, poor quality research. I rather highlight poor quality research that has been exposed. And I cover like retractions. But I also want to make it clear that, you know, these are like the outliers. Majority of research, you know, is generally speaking, you know, good quality, you know, is peer reviewed, to like, you know, high degree and receives a good degree of scrutiny. But basically, even though it's like a minority, I think poor quality research is exposed more often, you know, than it should be. But it's still a tiny minority. But, you know, that tiny minority, I think, does like a lot of damage when it comes to like, you know, public perception. Or like, yeah, like whatever, 98, 99% of scientific research, or at the very least, like 95%, is like, you know, good quality, and, you know, has been appropriately vetted, and, you know, meets a really good standard for high quality research. But I think that, you know, whatever, 1% or like somewhere in the 1 to 5%, I think is like, you know, so damaging when it comes to like public perception and, you know, public trust in the institution of science. That's why I cover it. I just want to make it clear that even though like I cover quite a bit for quality research, the overwhelming vast majority of research, like good quality. So yes, over 3 decades, placed. Most recently, Robert Terry, project manager at the World Health Organization, stated that the R&I days of the ECDG research and innovation, that the whole concept of a journal is kind of dead, actually. What we need is a complete rethink. To strong support from the DG Jean-Eric Paquet, and reiterated by the Council of the EU. Replacing traditional journals with a more modern solution is not a new idea. But the lack of progress since the first calls and ideas more than 20 years ago has convinced an increasing number of experts that the time for small tweaks is long gone, and a disruptive break is now overdue. So it's like, even though for, you know, as they say, going back more than 20 years, there have been calls to make changes, but since those calls have essentially so far been ignored, now it's like we got to make like major changes, or like the time is now for something, a major overhaul or some, you know, revolutionary change. The most prominent problem with already realized legislative consequences is the observation that empirical results can be less reliable than expected, an issue recognized as the replication crisis. I think virtually everyone, or, you know, most people are aware of this. Or at least most people that are either in research or follow research are aware of the replication crisis. Evidence suggests that the most prestigious journals, the ones that researchers must publish in or perish, are partly responsible for the observed lack of reliability by capitalizing on surprising, too good to be true results, while lacking proper quality controls. And we might be observing this play out, you know, currently with kind of like that room temperature superconductor research that was, you know, published or put out like, let's say, in the past week or so, and that, you know, now it looks like there's at least some sort of investigation, or that research is being called into question, or at the very least there are researchers trying to verify and repeat the research to see if the claims that they are making are actually true or hold water. The journal system is financed by academic libraries who pay subscription and or publication monies to an oligopoly of large international corporations who each own their separate monopoly, not only on the scholarly content in their journals, but also on assigning academic credibility via their journal brands. Yeah. So it's, at least in my mind, a little bit of a perverse system, where like if these companies, these are private companies, okay, So you have the vast majority of research, at least in whatever North America or developed countries, takes place at the university level, and is largely publicly funded. And yet, the metric that determines your success at a public research institution is whether you publish in these private, for-profit journals. Which doesn't make any sense to me. Seems like very strange. Of like, the metric is like pretty much your output. How much can you get into these private for-profit journals that basically have huge profit margins, as they will highlight themselves, of like they just make billions and billions of dollars, and it's pretty much compared to other industries, like they're just making money hand over fist. Over several decades, their single source exemption from procurement rules has led to an affordability crisis. Financial reports reveal corporate profit margins exceeding 40%, and excess public spending of the order of a factor of 10, compared with market-based pricing. Right, so yeah, as they say, like huge profit margins. And since these journals like have a monopoly, or at least these small group of journals have a monopoly on pretty much the entire, scientific publication endeavor. And it's not just like exceeding, like, they're at 41%. They're like at crazy, like 75%. Like they're just like, not like 41% or like 45%. They're just like way past that for some of these journals. But yeah, since they have like a monopoly, or like the small group of companies have, as they say, like an oligopoly on, scientific publication, they, they basically have a monopoly on pricing, of like, generally speaking, for a lot of these journals, if not like the majority of these journals, like you have to pay a fee, to get published. And also like if your university library, doesn't subscribe to these journals, well, then you have to pay a fee to access them. And even the libraries themselves, like or the university libraries themselves, have to pay subscription fees to these journals. And they basically like, pretty much control the market. They more or less, within reason, can set whatever price that they want. A lack of digital modernization has caused a further functionality crisis, characterized not only by missing digital tools needed to combat unreliability, but also by researcher time wasted on antiquated procedures, for example in discovery, submission, or review. These three crises fuel each other in a vicious cycle. Figure 1. So, pretty much here. Second. So, a vicious cycle of 3 crises. Yeah, I'm pretty much right there with you. Or like, definitely something in my mind, something has to change. And I'm not committed to like it has to be open free journals, although that's definitely what I strongly lean towards. But yeah, pretty much my guiding principle is some sort of open science concept. And that, like, yeah, at least in principle, it doesn't make any sense to me personally, as to the vast majority of research is publicly funded, as you say, taxes for public research funding, and yet it's published in these for-profit journals, that essentially the vast majority of the general public that is funding this research, they can't access the results. As in, like, public taxes are used to generate data, and the public can't actually see the data that they're essentially funding. That makes like 0 sense to me. And I think that should, at least in my mind, that should anger like the general public. But it doesn't seem to anger them. Or at least most of the anger just comes from, the actual researchers that are aware of it. So, yeah, a vicious cycle of three crises with their supra-inflationary price increases, profit maximizing journals overcharge via subscriptions or article processing charges, institutions by a factor of up to tenfold. Like, yeah, you have the private journals here, and they overcharge the institutions, and pretty much a lot of the institutions, at least whatever, in Canada or North America, and I think pretty much in the developed world, a lot of the institutions are publicly funded. Uh, and since these journals, or the companies of these journals, have a monopoly, they can overcharge, more or less. They charge whatever they want, or like, up to tenfold. Extracting library budgets with little, if anything, left for infrastructural development. The resulting lack of infrastructure funds is a crisis of affordability. Institutions cannot afford to invest in technology and its human support system that could relieve researchers of clerical tasks such as manuscript submission, data deposition, code publication, etc. This results in a functionality crisis that entails researchers lacking time, functionalities, and human support both for efficient scrutiny during the review process, as well as for making their own research open and reproducible.
Welcome to Flavor Country.
Oh, and Hazen Oz, thank you so much for the follow. Much appreciated. Happy to have you here. Right now, we're going over the peer review process, or hopefully how to revamp it. So, yeah, even though, what's marketed as science, or like what we philosophically understand that's built into science, is reproducibility, or as they say, replicability. Of like, yeah, you run an experiment, and are the results of the experiments reproducible? But since institutions, they lack affordability, one of the reasons they highlight that they lack affordability is because, like, the journals, they overcharge. And so, like, they can't invest in, pretty much the resources required for researchers to carry out, good, high quality. Oh, and Hari Krishna Rama 108, thank you so much for the follow. Much appreciated. So basically, since the institutions are basically kind of arguably wasting money to these journals, the researchers are underfunded. And so if the researchers lack the resources, they are going to cut corners. Even though on principle, they shouldn't. Even though on principle, every scientific researcher should uphold the pillars of science, of like reproducibility as one of them. Since the resources aren't there, and also since there's intense competition to like publish, since that is essentially what determines your success as a researcher, is your ability to publish and your productivity in terms of publications. Well, then you are essentially under-resourced, and then you are overly pressured to publish. Not only overly pressured from like, yeah, that's the metric that determines your success, and also you are competing against other researchers that may be investigating the exact same scientific question. Since again, metric that's used is first to publish, so it's a race. So whatever researcher crosses the finish line first and gets to publication, they win the race. And so corners are cut. If that is the metric and these are the conditions where you're under-resourced, well then what scientific researcher wants to take the time, wants to do their due diligence of saying, hey, yes, we got this result, but instead of going straight to publication, let's stop right here and like repeat it. Make sure it's robust. Make sure that it's reproducible. Given the conditions, they're going to be like, no. And also given the conditions that the journals themselves don't care about reproducibility. That's not part of the metric of success. It's just like, hey, can you get past the peer review process? And the peer review process itself is not upholding reproducibility. And so like there's literally no incentive to ensure reproducibility for anything that you publish. So yeah, you provide inadequate scrutiny and content, waste time. And yeah, what's not shown. Journals have apparently not invested their surplus into reviewer support, resulting in little improvement over the last decades, such that researchers are still lacking basic functionalities, such as, for example, comments via authoring system, direct author communication, AI-assisted error and fraud detection, efficient manuscript submission, etc., contributing to the functionality crisis. As the journals keep increasing their prices without a concomitant rise in investments, they fuel the replicability crisis. So, I'm not an entrepreneur or business owner, but, what little that I do know is, like, generally speaking, at least, some of the money that you make as a business is generally, like, reinvested back into the business, to at least in some way make it better. Of like, well, like, depending on what type of company you are, maybe increasing wages, or hiring more staff, or devoting more into like research and development if you're developing a product, etc., etc. But basically, some sort of reinvestment into like whatever business that you're trying to pretty much like build out, as opposed to like in this model here, this publication model, like there's no incentives for the journals to do that, and they have no reason to do that, because again, there's no incentive to change. Of like all the journals need to do, all they're responsible for is like publishing whatever gets thrown at their doorstep that they choose to peer review. And so there's no incentive, and so like the researchers are like forced to go to these journals, because if they don't go to these journals, well, then they're not deemed successful researchers or scientists, and so like they're not gonna get more funding, or they might not get tenureship, etc., etc., or they might not get other positions, postdocs, etc., etc. And so like the researchers are forced to go to these journals. You basically have an enforced market, or like you're upholding a market like for the sake of it, or like this, it's not actually a market, obviously. But like basically, if the researchers are whatever the customers have nowhere else to go but to these journals. You are basically you're the person selling water in the middle of like a drought, or where there's no other access to water, drinkable water. And so like, yeah, you can charge whatever you want, and also like there's no incentive for you to change, because like you need people coming to you. Where was I? Yes. So these three crises fuel each other in a vicious cycle. Yeah. The affordability crisis prevents institutions from combating the functionality crisis. The functionality crisis, in turn, fuels the replication crisis, for instance, by making peer review more cumbersome and by making research data and code harder to discover, access, reuse, and scrutinize. The journals propagating the replication crisis keep exacerbating the affordability crisis with super inflationary price increases. There are numerous other problems associated with current scholarly communication. We consider these three to be the most pressing, that many of the others are mere consequences of the three mentioned here. We're basically looking at the dying of thirst option rather than provide the rotten water merchants. I mean, so that's kind of like what they're highlighting here, if I'm understanding you correctly, of like pretty much researchers, at least from what I gather from my accounts of dealing with other researchers, like pretty much nobody likes this model, or at least nobody that I encounter really likes this model or likes the current state of affairs. But as mentioned earlier, like nobody essentially has not just the incentive, but essentially like the backbone to change, of like since researchers, academic researchers, professors, faculty members, their success is measured by publishing. But so basically nobody wants to take the hit to their success. Like if every single researcher agreed unanimously, and they all at once pretty much organized a strike against the journals of like, hey, we are not publishing in these journals anymore. This is like, an overnight thing of like every researcher across the world agree to that. Then like, yeah, the journals will change. Or at least something will change. But since, the researchers obviously, understandably, don't want to do that, then like the journals don't change. And obviously, since the journals don't change and there's no incentive for the journals to change, then the institutions, or what they overcharge the institutions, won't change. And then that's why it's a circle here. It's like they are locked into this cycle. And pretty much, I think that's like the best analogy that I can come up with. Of like, if something, for something to change, somewhere along this circle, a move has to be made, or like something or some institution has to make the first move, for it to change. But since there's like sort of an implicit agreement that no one's gonna make the first move, then it's just going to perpetuate the cycle, and you're just like locked into that cycle. Like, yeah, I think the best example is like the chess game. Built into the rules of chess is someone has to go first. Pretty much, white has to go first. If nobody actually makes the first move, like, you can't start the game. Thus, all three scholarly crises are interlocked in an ever-deteriorating vicious cycle, at the heart of which lies a public good in private hands, the scholarly literature. That's where it's like, yeah, it's like a very perverse system. The public good of like publicly funded research, but then we are just handing it off, as they say, in private hands, the scholarly literature. In this social dilemma, every player is at a disadvantage if they move first. So they all remain locked in. Neither researchers, forced to publish in journals due to the publish or perish reality, nor libraries, serving the reading and publishing needs of their faculty, are in a position to initiate reform. The corporate publishers are the only player profiting from this system. They exploit this lucrative situation by using their massive profits not only to resist and delay any research and public-oriented reform, but to fund a reform of their own and on their own terms. Their reform is not aimed at increasing the reliability of science or decreasing the financial burden on public institutions. Instead, it aims to multiply corporate revenue streams and market power even further. And then next section, surveillance capitalism. The major publishing houses, in no need of personalized advertisements due to handsome taxpayer funding, have recently been found to secretly track their academic users. Right, and again, so, yeah, going back to what I was saying earlier of like, yeah, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not a business owner, but like, yeah, for at least from what I understand, for most businesses, once when they make some profits or they have like an excess of profits, you typically some amount of that is reinvested back into the company. And as I mentioned, I'm sure there's multiple ways of reinvesting back into your company as an entrepreneur. One of them, as mentioned, might be like increasing wages, or more research and development into a product, or marketing and advertising. But since again, researchers are forced to go to these publishing companies, they don't have to market. They literally, on paper, or on principle, they could have zero marketing and advertising budget, and they will have an excess of, let's say, customers or consumers, where again, the researchers have no choice but to go to these publishing companies. And so like, yeah, they don't need to market or advertise themselves. It's like, just as the person selling water in a drought or in a desert, they don't need to market or advertise. Like, you have no choice but to go to this person, or in this case, but to go to these publishing companies. And as they're going to highlight here, what some of these companies do seem pretty sketchy, or might be breaking some laws depending on the country. They use the data to create personal profiles of academic behavior, such as when a user is searching for which topics, which journals or articles they open, or what sections of the documents they spend most time on. In their analysis, the German funding agency, DFG, has identified a whole host of unacceptable issues with the practice. It constitutes a violation of fundamental rights. Freedom of research and teaching are enshrined in the constitutions of many liberal democracies. Such tracking not only infringes on academic freedom, it also constitutes a violation of the right to protection of personal data, an encroachment of competition law, and reduces the value of public research investment. Since data on research activities can be collected by commercial research competitors or be made available to them for a fee. These are not merely abstract shortcomings, as tracking can expose scientists to specific and grave danger. From climate change to gender studies or racism, contentious areas of research are putting more and more scholars at risk. In Hungary, the government expelled the entire Central European University for political reasons, and in such cases, tracking information could be used to identify unruly academics to put pressure on them. As their behavioral profiles are tradable, they are open to all interested parties with the necessary funds. For instance, RELX, parent company of academic publisher Elsevier, is selling user data to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, user data to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So, like, it looks like they're collecting data, and like that data might be used for nefarious purposes, or might be used against you in terms of like the form of political pressure, especially like if you're conducting research that might be politically charged or might have political implications. If you're, let's say, exposed or you're being tracked by these publishing companies and your data is sold. Again, a whole host, I think, of potential negative outcomes. So, workflow monopoly. Additional revenue streams are only one of several reasons why so many academic publishing corporations deploy tracking technology. Another is to expand their monopoly from research articles to research data and eventually the entire academic workflow. Over the last decade, and this, as you'll see, this directly relates to like literally the tool that I'm using right now, that you're going to see shortly. Over the last decade, the 4 leading publishers have all acquired or developed a range of services aiming to develop vertical integration over the entire scientific process, from literature search to data acquisition, analysis, writing, publishing, and outreach. Figure 2. Like, yeah, this figure 2, you have pretty much like the major publishing companies or corporations that pretty much ban or like that are responsible for virtually all scientific publications. And if you look here, okay, Elsevier, so you have in the discovery and the writing phase, look at the little red box symbol. Okay, it's pretty much like this is the software that I'm using. Whoopsies. Sorry about that. It's literally the software that I'm using now. It's a reference manager called Mendeley, where this is software that I use to pretty much track all of my papers, research papers, scientific publications. And I use to like highlight and, make notes about and to, organize it. And I use to like reference when I'm writing things. So this is owned and developed by a company. And pretty much everything that I upload here is, on their cloud. So like they can track, they know what papers are in my library. If they really, I don't know if I'm being individually tracked, but if they had an interest in like seeing what it is that I'm looking at or the type of research that I'm collecting and curating, what I'm highlighting, what notes I'm taking, they can do that if they want to. And since this can interface with, let's say, Microsoft Word, or rather is can be integrated into Microsoft Word to use pretty much to make your references or like your citations. They can also see if they really wanted to, they can see what I'm citing or like what research I'm, citing and using as a reference if I happen to be writing up a research paper for publication. So user profiles inform the corporations in real time on who is currently working on which problems and where. This information allows them to offer bespoke packaged workflow solutions to institutions. For any institution buying such a workflow package, the risk of a vendor lock-in is very real. Without any standards, it becomes technically and financially nearly impossible to substitute a chosen service provider with another one. So this is kind of, at least the best analogy that I could come up with off the top of my head, is like, the Apple ecosystem of like, once you buy, an Apple product such as an iPhone, you are, from what I understand, you are essentially locked into their ecosystem. Like if you want to get your iPhone repaired, well then you got to go to the Genius Bar, or you have to pretty much like go to Apple. Like pretty much, for your iPhone related issues, you have no choice but to go to Apple. And kind of like, sort of similar principle here of like, well, yeah, through this entire workflow of like discovery, analysis, writing, publication, outreach, assessment, pretty much they want to be in charge of the entire process. Where, yeah, even again, using the iPhone or Apple products analogy, just like, yeah, for your software or software updates, you can only get them through Apple. For improvements in security, you can only get that through Apple. So in the best case, this non-substitutability will lead to a practically irreversible fragmentation of research objects and processes, as long as a plurality of service providers would be maintained. In the worst case, it will lead to complete dependence of a single dominant commercial provider. For academia, given the broad reach of such a monopolist, this worst-case scenario would constitute the equivalent of a Microsoft, SAP, Facebook monopoly. In the light of the experience with the scholarly literature, the expected consequences of such a development is that research quality, efficiency, and the free exchange of ideas and data could deteriorate substantially. The independence of universities and public research organizations, both national and EU, could drastically diminish. In that scenario, the current trifecta of crises might come to seem benign in comparison. Well, yeah, I mean, don't really need to dissect this figure, but this is just highlighting that a small handful of companies, it seems like their intention is, to build out and be in control of like the entire scientific endeavor, from discovery to assessment in the workflow. And it seems like some companies, like Elsevier, they have, something in each of the boxes. So some are further along than others. Second, the three aforementioned crises and the additional threat of a limited number of corporations gaining ownership of vast swaths of scientific data, including research and user data, in addition to their share of the scientific literature, has led experts to call for a disruptive break from the current locked-in vicious cycle. In particular, there is increasing agreement on the need to replace traditional journals with a modern scientific infrastructure, a decentralized, that is, federated, resilient, evolvable network based on open standards that allow seamlessly moving from one provider to another, under the governance of the scholarly community. Our companion publication elaborates more on the value of federation. Most recently, the League of European Research Universities emphasized that what is really needed is the development of an open, interconnected, publicly owned infrastructure. And actually, on paper, good, and I'm definitely not opposed to it in principle, like, an improvement on the current system. It's just like, it seems like something like that would require a lot of resources. I've been on a panel about the peer review process, or like, how the peer review process is like failing in the eyes of many, and like what to do about it. Some people on the panel that I don't agree with. But some of them were advocating for abolishing the entire peer review process, like basically a full open science of like, hey, you publish your stuff to like some database or like, some whatever website. And then, the peer review process is just like, everyone looking at it and scrutinizing it. Basically, no gatekeeping whatsoever. Kind of like pretty much whatever, one end of the spectrum, like arguably the most extreme open science. And then, I guess on the other end of the spectrum, you have the current model of like, gatekeeping. And I'm definitely, as much as I hate or like really despise and like the current publication or peer review process, I'm definitely not like a fully open, no gatekeeping publication model. I think some, if not, a decent amount of gatekeeping is good. I'm just like not sure exactly how to reform it or like who should be in charge of it. Of like I lean towards what was proposed on like one of the panels, like basically like having like a government institution like devoted to like peer review, or like independent peer review, like the gatekeeping kind of like outsourced, some sort of publicly funded institution, and not at the journals, which I can see working. I just foresee other potential problems with that. Yeah, so because one agreed goal is to de-center the journal article as the sole scientific output that counts, the replacement needs to encompass all components of the scholarly workflow, with modern technologies taking care of text, data, and code, allowing dynamic updating, version quality control, and tracking contributorship. And yeah, so as highlighted, or as I mentioned earlier, I think like this metric that's being upheld, of like the journal article as the sole scientific output that counts, of like, hey, you basically don't matter as a scientist if you're not publishing, which is like one of the things that I dislike the most. I think it's a really silly metric. And Rafa is God, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. Does how funding works have any impact on peer reviews? I have seen some people will select the peers that review. Is that actually so? Yeah, you are correct. So it varies by journal, but what I do know, because like I've been through the peer review process for a couple of journals, but this is not representative of every single peer review process out there. But for some peer review processes, when you submit your manuscript, you can recommend, peers as part of the peer review process. As in, like when you submit your manuscript, you could say, hey, it's probably a good idea if this other researcher reads it or peer reviews it. There's multiple reasons for that. One is like maybe to make the journal's job easier, so here's where it gets really tricky, because who says who is a peer, or like what's the dividing line between you are a peer and you are not a peer, and that's why it's like it's not unheard of, where you're pretty much like, ideally you're recommending someone that is qualified to evaluate your research, as in like, hey, this person, I know that they have the expertise to pretty much scrutinize and critique my research, and if needed, provide constructive feedback, or like recommendations on like what needs to be done to like get it past the peer review process, because like very often during the peer review process, they'll say like, hey, what you have is good, but if you actually want to be like accepted into the journal, you need to like do these further experiments, or like this other work needs to be done. It's totally a thing that like once you submit your manuscript, it'll get sent back saying, hey, like it's good, but we won't accept it until this is done, or like you provide some sort of strong case as to why you're not doing this. So like, yes, selecting your peers, your peer review, can be a thing. And that can go both ways. That can be either good or bad. So that is another excellent question. So, when it comes to once it's gone through the peer review process, so here is where pay no attention to the title of the article. I'm just using it as an example of like, so for many journals, I'm gonna highlight this. You have 3 dates here. They're pretty much, though not every journal does this, even though I think they should, but they're pretty much showing you basically, the dates of the publication process, or like, the stepping stones for the publication process. So you see it starts off with received and there's a date. So they're pretty much saying like, hey, the researchers for this journal, they submitted this manuscript, this potential publication. They submitted it to us for peer review on the 10th of December, 2021. And then here you have the accepted in February 2022. So pretty much like, 4 months later, 3-4 months later, it's accepted. Pretty much this is giving the stamp that it has passed the peer review process, and it will be published in a future publication, or in a future issue, I should say. And now they give you the actual publication date, which is like, that's what you are seeing now, or what we're seeing now on the screen. So you can see that there's, multiple potential delays. So to answer your question, once something has gone through the peer review process, so like in the formal peer review process of like accepted, then, the formal scrutiny ends, as in like pretty much it's not going to be looked at, pretty much, no new fresh eyes will see it until it's published. Okay, until like it's published either, to a journal, or like what you're seeing now. But then, other researchers, since now this is basically sort of, in the quote unquote public space, or like it's actually published for other eyes to see, well, then other eyes can scrutinize it, or other researchers can scrutinize it, or like the broader scientific community can scrutinize it if it happens to, come across, the things that they read, and they're actually qualified to, critique or peer review or review this research. And so like that I would call that the informal peer review process. So the actual answer to your question is like, once it has passed through the formal peer review process, there won't be a new formal peer review process. It'll just be subjected to, informal peer review, which like that's also a good thing. And that's why I highlighted, back up. Yeah. So that's why you have this website here that I highlighted earlier, of like the informal peer review process, or like, if something is flagged, okay, basically something can be retracted, of like, even after you've made it past the formal peer review process, basically the undo button can be pressed, of like, oh, turns out other researchers found something that we didn't, and we're going to issue, an official retraction, or we'll tell the original researchers, and we'll kind of like encourage them, or we'll leave it up to them whether they want to issue a formal retraction or take it in our own hands and be like, as a journal, we're going to retract it ourselves. Right. I'm not sure what you mean by, yeah, I'm not sure what that's referencing, the rank DS. But if you want to provide a link, by all means. Oh yeah, those are great questions, Rafa. As always. So, so it needs to replace the monopolies connected to the journals. Oh. This that's like a sign of like I guess too many retractions in my brain. So yeah, that was post peer review. Yeah, that physicist research. See if I can bring it up. So yeah, have better memory than I do. So yeah, the Rangadias, this individual here. So this is after formal peer review. So it got past the formal peer review process, and then it's only after the fact. You know, once it's actually reached a journal and other eyes from other researchers, like they saw it, and then now they are flagging it. So overall, yeah, the retractions are uncommon. Or like overall, when put in the context of like all of these scientific publications that are published, it's not common. It is pretty rare. As mentioned earlier, like the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of science that is published, that gets past the peer review process, like is good quality, or like is high quality research, you know, is done well, and that, you know, the retractions are like, you know, the bad research that I'm covering, you know, those are the exceptions. They're pretty rare, not common, but still, as mentioned, like very, very damaging to like public perceptions and public trust in science. Yeah, it needs to be first published, or like, you know, somehow if between acceptance and publication, you know, something gets yeah, like the journal gets notified by, you know, some external party, a retraction pretty much generally only takes place in that context. But yeah, it needs to replace the monopolies connected to the journals with a genuine, functioning, and well-regulated market. In this new market, substitutable service providers compete and innovate according to the conditions of the scholarly community, avoiding vendor lock-in. The replacement should not only solve the current crises, but also prevent corporate capture of the scientific commons. To ensure the replacement is more resilient than the status quo, two minimal conditions have to be met. There needs to be a set of open standards according to which the technical infrastructure operates. There also needs to be a governing body that oversees and enforces implementation, development, and resilience of the replacement. One could characterize the resulting federated scholarly information network with the term resilient openness. Open but resilient against corporate capture and surveillance technologies. And that's going to be like, assuming we want to, you know, develop this infrastructure. That's going to be like, you know, one of the major, you know, hurdles or challenges. Of like, yeah, we can develop a system, but we gotta protect it, or as they say, make it resilient against corporate capture. Which, you know, that seems like what has taken place with, you know, our current publication infrastructure. So we just have a small handful or group of companies in charge of all of scientific publication. So, open standards. Uh, in order for workflow service providers to become substitutable at a minimum, content and services need to be made accessible according to a set of enforced standards. To prevent commercial monopolization and to ensure cybersecurity, user, patient privacy, and future development, these standards need to be open and governed by the scholarly community. Open standards enable switching from one provider to another, allowing public institutions to develop tender or bidding processes in which service providers can compete with each other to offer their services for the scientific workflow. A direct consequence of such standards is that the single source exemption from procurement rules, the reason for the power legacy of publishers, no longer applies. Freed from this exemption, the EU has established a standard tender process for their publishing platform, Open Research Europe. Once that contract runs out, in contrast to the locked-in contracts with legacy publishers today, the EU may hold another tender for the subsequent contracts. This process shows that it has now become realistic to aim for a journal system replacement that restores the regular procurement processes used in all other domains also to the digital scholarly infrastructure. So it seems like, some kind of experiment was run by, Open Research Europe to see if maybe something alternative can be workable. And it seems like, at least so far, it is workable. There is no more need to reinvent the wheel for open scholarly infrastructures. Were you yourself ever scared of going through the peer review process? Is it diving into you personally? So I personally was, I've only been through it twice. So it's not like I have a mountain of experience, but I have some experience, and I also have, many colleagues that I know of that have gone through the peer review process. I'm pretty well familiar with it, either, directly with the few times that I've engaged with it, or indirectly, colleagues or other friends and former colleagues that I know who have gone through it. But yeah, to answer your question, so it's not damaging personally if peers find problems. Like, it really is like a learning process. Because, sometimes, if not more often than not, you can be too close to your research. We often think, understandably so, that, if you devote your life to something, or maybe if you devote a significant amount of time to something, of, let's say, trying to answer a specific scientific question, that, like, this is your area of expertise, and, like, the ins and outs of, like, that particular thing that you're working on. But sometimes you can be, like, too close to it. Of, like, you basically can get tunnel vision. Of, like, you're just, like, so solely focused that it can kind of, like, block you off or prevent you from seeing things from a different perspective. Or, like, you might be inadvertently overlooking things because, like, you're too close to the research, or, like, too focused on it. The best offhand, the best analogy that I can come up with of, like, you can be, like, too close to your screen. Of, like, if I'm too close to my monitor, okay, like, yeah, I'm seeing, like, some individual pixels, and, I'm, like, the closest to my monitor, but, like, I can't see the full picture. And it's only, like, when I step back, that, like, I see the full picture, and then I can get a broader overview. So, like, you need a different perspective. You need to shift your perspective. But if you're so zoomed in, you are sometimes not in the best position to alter your perspective, kind of, like, too close to it. And that is totally one of the benefits of the peer review process. Of, like, they offer a different perspective, and they're obviously not as close to the research, and so they might be able to take a more zoomed out look, and they might be able to pinpoint things that you have overlooked, that you might be too close to the research, or you might be too conditioned to think a certain way, that you're just, like, too locked in see it a different way. So yeah, all that to say, it's generally used for a learning process, or to improve the quality of your research. There's totally exceptions to that, where sometimes you know you're being peer reviewed by one of your competitors, and they don't want your research published because it's not in the person who's reviewing the research. It's not in their interest. But like generally speaking, the principle is like, yeah, for learning and to improve the quality of the research, or like uphold the quality of scientific rigor. The basis for such standards exists and only needs to be expanded, adopted, and enforced. Such standards, evolving with feedback from the scientific community, would not only serve to make service providers interoperable, but they would also bring the means of scholarly communication back under the sovereignty of the scholarly community. As an added benefit, the criteria defined in these standards, that is, following open science and fair principles, not only allow for the substitutability of service providers, but also assist scientists in following guidelines for good scientific practice. Such standards and the open infrastructures they enable thus prevent vendor lock-in, increase price pressure, promote innovation, and increase the reliability of science. This replacement goal tackles the trifecta of scholarly crises all at the same time. Yeah, also, again, as usual, great questions, Rafa. And like, even just, I guess, to highlight that fact, of like, you asked a question, that like, was a very good question. That should have been answered, probably from the get-go, of like, what is the overall point of the peer review process, or like what are some of its basic functions. But like, I'm arguably too close to it, of like, I was just operating under the assumption that like people know, because like, I come from a certain perspective, where like, at least generally speaking, in the circles that I run in, or let's say amongst my colleagues or former colleagues, like, we just implicitly know, or like, we just kind of like instinctually know what the peer review process is, or like what the experience is like, for the peer review process. And I personally wouldn't have thought share that information unless you had asked that question, where, assuming you're not in the sciences or maybe more disconnected from it, I wouldn't have thought to ask the obvious question, like the obvious question, or like the fundamental question of like, what's it like going through the peer review process, or like, what is the fundamental purpose of the peer review process? Again, sometimes you just need a different perspective, just to see the obvious. So, governance. To govern standards equitably, a body analogous to, for example, the W3C, needs to form under the governance of the scholarly community to allow the development of open scholarly infrastructures servicing the entire research workflow. A detailed proposal for the governance of such a body is beyond the scope of the present proposal. Global work of UNESCO on the recommendations on open science and the stakeholder-driven governance of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, with a General Assembly of all members and an elected steering board, could provide inspiration. Vital is that the governing body or bodies would be assembled by competence and by representation of experts in this, and that corporate capture is vigorously resisted. W3C provides a warning example, which, for example, Co-ARA achieves by explicitly barring commercial actors from membership in the coalition. So it's like, they're proposing something in terms of like, some new infrastructure, or like some new institution, that, let's say, kind of like a new publishing model. And so it's like, how do we prevent it from like, just like the same thing playing out? Or like, they want to, they want to definitely prevent, as they say, corporate capture of like pretty much not associated, or no corporate involvement, whatsoever. Yeah, exactly. Adequate, diverse representation, complementing the competence of experts, may be ensured in such a bodies by means of Drawing from experience of corporate capture, both in centralized as well as distributed systems, the governance of the scholarly community ensures the practical practical implementation of resilient openness in the journal replacement. So, like, what is the practical implementation? And actually, I'm only really going to read the first paragraph in the highlighted section because actually there's a little bit of a typo, or like a strong string of typos. This section here, it actually repeats twice. I like this here. Humanities Commons HC. Humanities Commons HC. I think this is just like a printing error, but it might have been actually a peer review error in this publication here. That like a complete block of text that's repeated twice got through it. So there is no shortage of technical solutions to implement a replacement, both from large service providers and from startups and community initiatives. More than 700 tools and solutions are ready to be implemented once an open scholarly standard has been put into place. The technical feasibility of the basic infrastructure for preserving all digital research objects, including text, data, and software code, is not in question. What is very much in question, however, is to whom specifically to entrust the preservation of the world's scientific knowledge. The main candidates for this role are public research teaching institutions that already support the vast majority of researchers producing scientific knowledge, national or multinational consortia or governments, for example, the EU and their agency, scholarly learned societies, or independent organizations. Have they been successful in preventing corporate capture? Or is it like money? So, as of right now, okay, given the current situation, they have not been successful in preventing corporate capture. Pretty much what they're essentially arguing here, in this editorial, I guess you can say, is like corporate capture has taken place. You have these small group of companies that basically they are in charge, or they have power over pretty much all of scientific publication. And so now what they're doing is they're trying to propose, or like they're trying to outline how to prevent corporate capture with this, potentially new system that they're proposing. And yeah, it is totally, that's the first thing that came to my mind. But it totally does repeat. Like we have here, I'm gonna highlight it like green, and then you have it pretty much the exact same thing here. Even more than that, it repeats. Highlighted in red. Just like a straight, like this is repeated pretty much all here. Pretty large oversight. I would like to think it's just like some, copy and pasting error. Who knows? I'm reasonably sure, but I don't know for sure, but I'm reasonably sure that this wasn't there in the original article. It's just like some sort of formatting issue. And yeah, science is totally, I think that's not emphasized enough to the general public, of just like how messy science is. Not just messy in terms of like, publication, but like I'm sure probably even you yourself know that even just like when it comes to like, carrying out research in a lab, like even like the most prestigious, at least from what I've seen, okay, like, the labs with like, a bunch of funding, the prestigious labs, at whatever, Harvard or Stanford, if you go look in those labs, it's not like this perfectly organized, it's definitely not what you see in movies. It's like, it's messy, definitely not like the most organized, and just like, it's like nitty gritty, for lack of a better term. There are also independent non-profit platforms where service providers can be substituted. For example, Public Library of Science, PLOS or PLOS One. I think that's a great, at least from what I can tell, and I actually like this journal. Well, of Public Library of Science, is pretty much an open science journal that covers pretty much a wide range of disciplines. You have psychology, cell biology. I think it covers like virtually or just every discipline out there. Where like, yeah, it's in the name, Public Library of Science. The public can access it. While these still sport the journal container, they are demonstrating the feasibility of non-profit organizations overseeing scholarly infrastructures and developing revenue streams to keep the operations afloat. The newly established board of ORC is also now an independent body and hence fulfills the criterion of scholarly governance. Thus, it is clear that taking the 4 levels together, all the components making up the various layers in Figure 3 are already available in some form as a practical implementation. Which option the scholarly community will choose will also set the path for what kind of standards are going to be adopted. Depending on how the current implementations are operating, the choice is there. What is missing is an expert representation of the scholarly community to make the... So, arguably, this is analogous to politics, where it's like, we know the path forward. What is lacking is like political will, or just like, for someone to make the first move. Or as they, explicitly say here, some representation of the scholarly community to make these choices. Of like, hey, gotta start somewhere. Once an alternative is established, every institution is empowered to replace their secret negotiations with regular tender processes, tackling the affordability crisis. Experience with tender processes is not limited to ORE. Scholarly societies have held tenders for their publication needs, and the Scope 3 project goes back over a decade. These bidding processes commonly also specify the functionalities of the platforms, tackling the functionality crisis. When they are regulated to be fair and open, market forces can foster innovation, efficiency, and benefit customers by exerting price pressure. This framework would create a completely new, well-regulated market with genuine competition and eliminate the current monopoly conglomerate. Unlike the current system, this market will be easier to regulate should dominant players arise. Moreover, the new framework needs not only to cater to traditional businesses, but being digital, will also encompass more modern forms of service providers on all scales between non-profit and for-profit. Open source software development has a decades-long tradition in the scholarly community, and the new framework, by receiving funds currently supporting legacy journals, will finally offer sustainable support for it on a global scale. Infrastructure initiatives such as the European Open Science Cloud seamlessly integrate into the replacement framework due to the shared standards. The granularity of services and providers, package sizes, and workflow solutions can be chosen by each institution and their users. Expert users are free to replace institutional components by components of their choice, or develop entirely new custom components themselves, analogous to how institutions now can substitute one, say, electricity, heating, or email provider with another one with minimal disruption. Providers can, in principle, be substituted on any desired level of granularity, individual components or large package solutions. This disruptive break would bring the procurement rules of the digital scholarly infrastructure in line with those of the non-digital structure. What are also the technical advantages? All scholarly content can be made available at single addresses despite the decentralized organization of the underlying invisible infrastructure. In that way, both global access to all scholarly content as well as access to subsections become conveniently available at any granularity. And this is where I think one of the biggest advantages, at least in my opinion, of like, again, in principle, it doesn't make any sense to me that, science is hidden behind a paywall. Even to other scientists, of like, if your university or institution doesn't subscribe to that journal, well, then you're basically out of luck. Or you can try your luck at emailing or contacting the researcher whose publication you want to read, and they might provide you with a free copy. But outside of that, or, using, let's say, Sci-Hub, or, some being a good Google detective, you pretty much can't access it. And just, at least fundamentally, principle doesn't make any sense to me. And if anything, I would say holds science back. Because, the more people, looking at research, the more eyes on the research, I think is better. Not only in terms of like, upholding quality science, but just also to being exposed to new ideas. As and also just to ultimately foster collaboration and cooperation, which, on paper, we as scientists are supposed to be pursuing like the same thing of like whatever truth or understanding the world, etc., etc. And yet, ultimately, in reality, we're all competing. The best example that I can use of like, when the pandemic started, okay, pretty much all, and I think that holds true even today, like virtually all of SARS-CoV-2 related research is like made available. Pretty much anybody can access it. And when the genome or when the SARS-CoV-2 was sequenced and its whatever genome was solved, like that was like made available, that was like uploaded to the database for other researchers to, understandably make use of, to accelerate research on understanding SARS-CoV-2. Like just think if like, if the genome was sequenced and like whatever research group, I think it was, China that first published or made available, and I think there was some delay in, publishing the genome, but like just think if like, the genome was solved and like they chose not to publish it or to not make it available at all. I think most people like would take strong issue with that, given the context of like, when the pandemic started. It's like we want all research hands or even non-research hands on deck of like, hey, we all in a collaborative and cooperative manner need to be pursuing the same goal, and it doesn't serve our ultimate goals if we start hiding our research or we don't make it freely available to everyone. And that's why you have like, these preprints, like pretty much, there was such a strong push to get research out there and make it available, of like you have like just more and more preprint servers of like, hey, this research isn't even peer-reviewed yet, but we want to get it out there just for the sake of getting it out there, and hopefully it's, of use to other researchers. And so like just the fact that any research is hidden behind a paywall, I think doesn't make sense at multiple levels. Where was I? Yeah. The problem is Alzheimer's. Well, that can be easily solved with, some sort of collar that reminds them. Some sort of wearable technology. Arguably at this point, there should be like a bell or some sort of, tracking device on like every old person or elderly person at this point. With the appropriate back-end solution, a large section of this decentralized network could go offline, and the remaining nodes would still be able to offer 100% of the content. In addition to this resilience, cybersecurity is increased even further by eliminating the tracking software currently deployed by publishers. Removal of the journal brand as a pervasive incentive, together with automated data and code accessibility for scrutiny, tackles the two most important aspects of the replication crisis. Right. Dynamic updating and version control with persistent identifiers allows scholarly outputs to move from a static version of record to living outputs, which can be rapidly updated to reflect the best available knowledge at any time. That is a record of versions. Well, yeah, first of all, I am sorry to hear that. And I can empathize somewhat with my grandmother, but I am not living with my grandmother. But my grandmother just celebrated their 90th birthday a couple of months ago. And they are essentially in an assisted living facility. So, like, they're largely independent, but some things, like, being able to cook for yourself, they can't really do on their own. So, semi-independent assisted living. And, like, yeah, there's definitely some cognitive decline or cognitive impairment that is occurring. Oh yeah, and yeah, for you, so for now, I hope it stays that way. But like, yeah, there's definitely been a sharp decline in my grandmother's, cognitive function and their ability, or like, this like extreme polarity inability to remember. And this is, not to make light of it, but this is so interesting at a neuroscientific level of like, my grandmother can sometimes like forget like, a conversation that we had like 5 minutes ago, but she'll extract like a memory that is like 50 years old and remember it with like crystal clear clarity, or like a memory that's 20 years old that's related to me. Like, oh, I was there, and like my grandmother is giving like a perfect recounting of the situation and the memory. At least, if I'm some sort of corroborating witness, which I'm hoping, my memory's better than my grandmother's. But like, yeah, she'll not remember the question that she asked me like 5 minutes ago sometimes. And it's like, yeah, super. There's definitely, as you say, a comical aspect to it, but there's also like that disheartening aspect, at least for me personally. I'm sure also for you as well, to some extent, of like some pieces of my grandmother are like kind of like withering away. That is like not fun. Sure. But then every once in a while, there's like real moments of clarity. Of like, 1 second she'll like be like on the ball and like recollect something that's like super obscure. And like, the next thing, it's like she might not be all that aware of her surroundings. Or like, not recognize, a family member. Yeah. Like, there's the brief moments of like levity that I can make light of. And then, but like overall, yeah, it is, at least for me personally, pretty rough. Thank you so much, Kitty. I appreciate that. But I also understand this is aging. And unfortunately, I think I mentioned this on a panel recently of like, at least in developed countries or Western countries, I don't think we treat our elderly all that well. Or actually with confidence that we don't treat our elderly well at all. And we just kind of like, push them to the side type of thing. Out of sight, out of mind. Where was I? Yes, I think I was right here. Dynamic updating and version control with persistent identifiers allows scholarly outputs to move from, I think I read that. So new models for tracking of contributorship and provenance will complement or even replace traditional authorship and help establish credit for valuable scientific activities not traditionally counted, such as generating and managing research data, peer review, brainstorming hypotheses or incremental improvements to open software, improved peer review functionalities such as direct author-reviewer interactions, peer review aimed at all research output and not just narratives, transparent review, computer-assisted review, and flexible anonymity and pseudonymity solutions contribute to more efficient quality control. Layered reputation systems for both research objects and users further support the trustworthiness of research objects and researchers. Visual interfaces, semantic search, and content mining solutions not only save researchers time and improve the quality of the discovery process, but also allow software agents to derive novel hypotheses by analyzing vast data networks with machine learning algorithms. All of these data and tools can fuel augmented intelligence systems, where artificial intelligence is combined with human intelligence to facilitate large-scale scientific collaboration. Right, so you know, whether this actually comes to fruition, remains to be seen. I would say pretty ambitious. But, what they're highlighting here, on paper, sounds really great. Because, again, as they're highlighting here, there's many drawbacks, or, basically, arguably, what they're saying is like the current peer review and publication process is broken or fundamentally flawed, and it has multiple deleterious effects. One of them is just like reduced productivity, where the peer review process can be like quite slow. Going back to this article here, where they give pretty much like the timeline of like, hey, we received it to review in October, we accepted it, got past peer review in February, and then it made it to full publication basically at the beginning or end of April, beginning of May. So pretty much from like writing it up and submitting it to the journal, actual publication, past peer review, that's in the span of like 6 months. So pretty strong delay, and totally the peer review process, or like getting to full publication, once you've completed your manuscript, can be stretched out for years. And as highlighted earlier, since there's essentially a monopoly or oligopoly on the entirety of scientific publication, the publishing corporations have no incentive to change. They're not implementing, as far as I can tell, they're not implementing any sort of like AI-assisted peer review. They're basically not doing anything to accelerate the peer review process, or even to accelerate research, because there's no incentive to. They always have basically a customer or consumer base, and they can just make money hand over fist, and not do anything with it except reap the profits. But as they're highlighting here, if there's a new system, you could actually reinvest or design a system that can, accelerate not only the peer review process, but the research process overall. Social technology will be built into the community layer, increasingly adopted and supported by public institutions, including scholarly institutions. Mastodon is a social technology analogously federated as the journal replacement we propose here, and hence well-suited to be part of this new infrastructure. From puts in Mastodon to print-on-demand monographs, a scholarly information network will cover scholarly communication in all its diverse forms. See our companion publication for more on how to realize these social aspects of scholarship. From improving essentially every single process in which scholars interact with their topic of study to machine learning-derived hypotheses, there are no downsides to replacing antiquated journals with modern technology. While any journal replacement will never be perfect, it will at least come with the tools and prerequisites to help mitigate researchers' all-too-human tendencies to cut corners, tell stories, or cheat, in contrast to the journal system, which has proven time and again to exacerbate these traits. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. Pretty common saying. Don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. I use that pretty frequently. So wrapping up potential challenges, which, again, as they say, almost certainly no perfect system, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make things better or try something entirely new. Some of the challenges already present today may not be immediately solved by replacing journals, but in many cases they stand to improve from the superior mitigation options such a replacement offers. Clearly, the procurement rules in non-digital infrastructure are not a panacea or panacea. For instance, tender processes are not without problems and challenges. Nevertheless, they provide sufficient advantages over other forms of public spending that they remain the dominant mechanism in most countries. Importantly, despite their problems.
Welcome to Flavor
Oh,
Country.
and yes, I apologize if I mispronounced your username, but Yeon, thank you so much for the follow. Much appreciated. Happy to have you here. Yeah, importantly, despite their problems, tender processes are superior to secret negotiations for transparency reasons alone. Moreover, once superior procurement methods improving on tenders have been developed, they can be applied to the journal replacement as well, marking yet another advantage. Not all scholarly outputs can or should be made immediately and completely open and accessible. In disciplines and scenarios where privacy, patents, cultural sensitivities, or proprietary data are an issue, embargoes or restricted access may have to be imposed. And here's where, certainly, there's maybe some element of privacy concern, especially with like a fully open science. I would probably push back, as someone who's pretty staunchly against, intellectual property or patents. Yeah, I don't think there should be any protections for that. But like, yeah, and I'm curious as to what they exactly mean by cultural sensitivities. But I can, I think I understand what they mean. But basically, I think at least for me, the major concern is like privacy. I don't really care about proprietary data. Since like, yeah, I don't advocate for upholding intellectual property. This is already possible in some institutional repositories and preprint archives. Importantly, in the current system, the default is closed science, with additional efforts required to make scholarship open. In the journal replacement, default will be open, and scholars get to decide how much effort they need to invest to safeguard their scholarship. Right. Market failure and corporate capture remain constant threats, also for the new market envisaged here. The risk of so-called free markets under neoliberalism are well known. Therefore, the creation of functional market mechanisms is necessary to abolish the current monopolistic structures and prevent future vendor lock-in. That alone is not sufficient. Proper regulation is essential, potentially involving introduction of first sale doctrine in scholarly publishing, copyright reform, and most importantly, the monitoring of antitrust violations. The journal replacement enables to leverage tried and tested market regulation mechanisms from other infrastructure domains such as electricity or telecommunications to be applied also for scholarly infrastructures to prevent monopolization of content and services. A straightforward example specific to scholarly works are overlay services that source the open content but reside outside of the network itself. Here, we can envision a wide range of services, both scholarly and commercial, designed to add value to research objects. This added value may include quality control through peer review, as in the case of Peer Community In, where a community of scholars reviews preprint articles on public servers independent of journals. We can also imagine services running reproducibility checks and provide further quality assurance. And I think this is actually pretty important, as I mentioned earlier, of like, what is supposed to be part of the peer review process, or not peer, but rather part of the scientific endeavor is like this reproducibility aspect. And it seems like, they would want to emphasize that more with their model. This has already been implemented on the level of journals. For example, AEA Data Editor, University Services, R² from Cornell University, and independent proof testing by so-called Red Team. It is easy to imagine how such existing services can acquire a dominant, quasi-monopolistic power. Once all scholarly content is accessible in a scholarly infrastructure, a whole host of new services stand to be developed. To prevent existing and new providers from exerting undue power, the scholarly community may decide, for instance, to prevent public funds from being spent on services that are not open source, increasing the chances of competitors arising or institutions to be able to offer the services themselves. A no patent rule would be another measure. A final challenge that needs to be addressed with respect to journal replacement is the reward structure currently baked into the monopolistic journal system. One of the core aims of this proposal is to defund the monopolists in order to remove the pernicious incentives they entail. The funding redirection below. Removing the pernicious incentives together with making the use of the journal replacement attractive and time-saving ought to be sufficient to change researcher behavior. However, should this not be the case, The journal replacement offers a wealth of alternative, quantitative, and qualitative ways to empower selection or evaluation committees to make evidence-based choices without the current pernicious consequence. Main but not exclusive factor here is the separation between how research is performed and communicated and the way it is evaluated. Central concept also emphasized by, for example, DORA and COARA. So, funding redirection. While a standards body under the governance of the scholarly community still remains to be formed, technically there do not seem to be any major hurdles for replacing journals. However, one crucial question remains that has not yet been settled, and it is not a technical but a social or political question. With everybody locked in, who is to act in which way to ensure the redirection of funds from the legacy system to the replacement solution, that is, an open scholarly infrastructure. Historically, funding agencies have ensured minimum working conditions at fund institutions by requiring specific infrastructures. Some funding agencies have expanded these eligibility criteria to also include criteria for good scientific practice, such as the German DFG. Along the same veins, funding agencies have recently started to also include institutions' evaluation procedures in their eligibility criteria. Wellcome or Templeton World Charity Foundation are leading the way by refusing to fund applicants at institutions that evaluate researchers by the journals they publish in. Take a step in the right direction. One does not need to completely exclude institutions from funding to incentivize change. For instance, in Finland's national funding model for universities, certain openly accessible research objects rank 20% higher than legacy objects. With open research practices becoming more and more commonplace, such analogous incentives for institutions to provide an infrastructure that not only supports these practices across the board, but simultaneously addresses the most pressing scholarly problems is just common sense. Updating such funder guidelines and criteria to reward the redirection of current funds towards open infrastructure components that tackle the three crises and at the same time disincentivize maintenance of funding for the legacy infrastructures that are fueling the crises would help realign the financial incentives for institutions with public and scholarly interest. With the journal articles currently being overpaid by a factor of 10, the level of library funding is more than sufficient to implement any desired technology. So it's like, yeah, as they're pretty much saying, funding redirection. There are, basically the vast majority, if not all institutions or library institutions are wasting money funding these journals where you can pretty much redirect these funds. The European Commission, long having recognized the non-substitutability of academic publishers, the Commission found that consumers will rarely substitute one publication for another following a change in the relative prices, can be identified as another important factor. Regulatory bodies such as those in the EU may update their regulatory frameworks to include alternative scholarly publishing solutions such as those outlined above, and declare that the traditional single source exemption no longer be applied by publicly scholarly institutions. As a consequence, the traditional institutional and consortial and typically secret negotiations with publishers would have to be scrapped, and institutions would need to host tenders for their publishing needs. Such tenders exert real price pressure on bidding organizations and hence can free funds for the implementation of the funder requirements outlined above. The latest conclusions from the Council of the European Union support this perspective and call for solutions that are perfectly aligned with our proposals here. So yeah, seems like essentially it's feasible for this to be implemented. Just as usual, it's a matter of will. The money is there, and as they say, or as they highlight, they are universities or university libraries are overspending on journals. So it's just a matter of redirecting the funding. Ownership involves socially recognized economic rights. First and foremost, the exclusive control over that property, with the self-efficacy it affords. The inability to exert such control over crucial components of their scholarly infrastructure in the face of a generally recognized need for action for over 3 decades now evinces the dramatic erosion of real ownership rights for the scholarly community over said infrastructure. Thus, this proposal is motivated not only by the now very urgent need to restore such ownership to the scholarly community, but also by the understanding that through funding bodies, scholars may have an effective and proven ally at their disposal to identify game-changing actions, design a financial incentive structure for recipient institutions that can help realize the restoration of ownership, with the goal to implement open digital infrastructures that are as effective and as invisible as any non-digital infrastructure. So, wrapping up in summary, and here's pretty much a summary of like the recommendations. So in summary, we argue that the time is ripe to replace traditional and outdated academic journals with an open, interoperable, and community-governed modern scholarly information infrastructure. To this end, we recommend the following steps to be urgently taken. An international body comprising not-for-profit organizations should be formed to codify, develop, and oversee implementation of open standards for a modern scholarly information system. Second, open, interoperable, and publicly owned solutions for each facet and layer of scholarly information need to be extended, refined, sustained, and where necessary, created. Funding that is currently spent on journal publishing should be increasingly redirected towards supporting the new infrastructure. We identified two factors that can incentivize such reallocation of funds. Public research funders, including governments, should update the eligibility conditions for recipient institutions of their grants to include such infrastructure requirements. So basically, government funding comes with strings attached, which, actually, I guess the best example that I can think of, off the top of my head, let's say, and from a Canadian perspective, it's like, so, in Canada, healthcare is essentially healthcare infrastructure and administering healthcare is a provincial matter, but a lot of the funding of healthcare at a provincial level comes from the federal government. And so, like, you have these health transfer payments, as in the federal government gives federal money to each province, and that is, relegated, that's supposed to be relegated to healthcare spending. And very often, the health transfer payments coming from the federal government says like, well, you're supposed to be doing this, or essentially it comes with strings attached. It's not just, hey, here's the money and the province does whatever they want with it. And so essentially similar model there of like, yeah, universities get the money or get the government funding, but like, yeah, have to set aside some money like building out the infrastructure that they're outlining here. Market regulators should enforce tenders as the method of procurement for scholarly communications infrastructures, preventing negotiations with monopolistic corporations. The increasing momentum on reforming the criteria used for assessing research to focus on the intrinsic merits and openness of scholarly work, instead of the prestige of the outlet where it appears, makes this a uniquely opportune moment for a renewed push to modernize our scholarly information architecture. Which, like, yeah, I agree with this. Even though I highlight research in prestigious journals like Nature, Science, Cell, Journal of Biological Chemistry, although that's a little bit more niche, but that is like a very high impact journal. I don't think that should be, I don't like upholding that metric of like, your research only matters, or like it looks good on your CV if you publish in Nature or Science or Cell. Like these prestige journals, I think are pretty silly principle. Similar to the case of research assessment itself, ultimately the choice and the responsibility of how we communicate research is in the hands of the scholarly community, if we only are able to seize the chance. During the peer review process of this article, the Council of the EU has adopted conclusions on scholarly publishing that echo our proposal here. For example, the Council encourages member states and the Commission to invest in and foster interoperable not-for-profit infrastructures for publishing based on open source software and open standards, in order to avoid the lock-in of services as well as proprietary systems, and to connect these infrastructures to the EOSC. On the same day, 10 major research organizations came out in support of the Council document. We take this as a strong endorsement of the ideas in this and our companion article. which maybe at some point I should cover their companion article. Like, yeah, I think this lays out pretty well, and I think pretty clearly, some of the fundamental flaws in the peer review and publication model that's currently in place. And I think they correctly highlight why it's locked in, and it's rigid. And even though everyone wants it to change, no change appears to be happening. And I think they give like good recommendations as to like a way forward. I don't think, I don't necessarily agree with everything in terms of like their step-by-step plan of like this should be done, this should be done. But I think overall, like the reforms that they recommend, I agree with. Like, this is a good path forward that at the very least should be tried. I agree with you. They're not anxious for change, because like there's literally, they're, as mentioned, they have huge profit margins. They're making literally billions and billions of dollars, and like a lot of it just like in pure profit. And so like, yeah, it depends on what you mean by anxious for change. If you mean anxious as in like they're not enthusiastic about it, I would agree with you. They're almost certainly not enthusiastic about it. But as this article highlights, I think the time like ripe, or like, if not now, when? Even though, again, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of scientific research that's published is, good quality, and, is done, whatever, ethically. I think, yeah, there's a little bit too much poor quality or like fraudulent research that gets by, or gets exposed, that I think some change is needed, or at the very least, even just for the sake of restoring public trust in science or the institutions of science. I think more openness and more transparency is the way forward. And also more engagement by scientists with the public. I think that's also like another huge hurdle that, erodes public trust in science. Of just like, generally speaking, scientists, in my experience, and I'm not saying I'm good at, but I think generally speaking, scientists are not good at engaging the public or translating science to the public. I attempt to do that, but whether I'm good at it or not, I have no idea. But that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. I think I got through everything that I wanted to cover. So I think I'm gonna end the stream here for this content, but just maybe as a preview for the next stream or other content that I want to cover. Definitely gonna cover this. And speaking of umbrella review, and also actually, there's some interesting research that was published just recently. So like a series of papers. Like this is like a string of like 4 publications from like a similar research group. Pretty much all in the vein of essentially like social media happening here. Yeah. Or like, how social media, shapes politics or has an effect on politics, either positive or negatives. And going back to like, prestige publications, basically all 4 of these publications, they're either coming from Science or Nature, as in it's 3 science publications and 1 Nature publication, where it seems like, these all hit the streets of science pretty much all at the same time. And I think there's a lot of overlapping researchers involved. Definitely going to cover that. I'm not sure about next stream, but pretty much in this, sometime this week. But I also want to cover, I think probably the next stream that I'm going to cover is do this. or rather just under the vein of, let's say, scientific debate, or how do we try to settle debate in science, because I covered this research here, like I think last year, or like a few months ago, of like this umbrella review about, you know, the serotonin theory of depression, essentially concluded that, like, hey, you know, this theory of depression, like the evidence backing it up is, you know, either low quality or not really there. And then in response, just like recently, like in the past month or so, this was published of like, yeah, pretty much as a response to that, pretty much the opposite side of the argument of like these researchers from their review, they're calling into question, or, you know, in their mind, they might be whatever, debunking the serotonin theory of depression. And then this group of researchers here, which there's some pretty renowned researchers involved with, pretty much coming out, you know, their response saying, hey, actually, there is evidence, but there's some clear flaws in the review that you did, and that, like, hey, you shouldn't dismiss this theory yet, or like what you're using to dismiss this theory, no bueno. And then, yeah, I'm gonna cover this also on the topic of and this is pretty much in that vein, of like, this came out recently, just a few months ago, of like, hey, like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, of like, maybe the research about the benefits of exercise may not be the best quality, or like, you know, how can we do better in the future? But with that, let's see if I can find someone to raid. And also, thank you, Kitty. Much appreciated. Super grateful. Okay, well, so I'm gonna raid someone totally different. Not science and research. They are fitness and health streamer. I'm rating them because I used to be a fitness and health I used to stream my workouts that I'm hoping to do again in the future. And I'm also a mod in their community, or in her community. So I'm gonna raid them to support them. But like, not a sign. They're doing a workout stream. That is their content. But I think they deserve to be rated. But yeah, I plan to stream next on Tuesday. So like, yeah, Sunday, Monday, gonna take off, and hopefully moving forward, my plan is to stream, you know, 4 times per week. I'm gonna start posting my schedule pretty soon in the Discord, at the very least. I try to make it known when I'm about to go live, or will be going live. But I'm trying to work out the schedule where I'll stream Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. But I think at bare minimum, I try to aim for a stream 3 times per week, ideally for the next little while. And also, if you want to suggest topics or research, you can also join the Discord to do that there, and also to DM me. And also, I'm going to post the papers that I covered here in the Discord if you're interested in reading them on your own. But yeah, I'm gonna set up the raid to try. Again, it's a fitness and health streamer, workout stream. I'm just giving my support. But yeah, not a science and technology streamer. But I think you should follow them because they do great workout streams, and it's a wonderful community. But I'm biased because I'm a mod in their community. But I still think if you're not following them, you should be following them. But yeah, with that, I want to thank everyone that passed by. Kitty, iCow, Rafa, Boy Meets Mini, Sir Leviticus. I'm missing a bunch of people, which I apologize for. Oh, Orange Hue, much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you for the follows. As in Oz, Roslyn, Harry Krishna Rama 108, much appreciated. And Eon, thank you for the follow. And again, if you're not following Shy, you should be. So I'm gonna up. And yeah, I plan to be back on Tuesday. Since my sleep has been holding up pretty well the last little while, I'm highly confident on Tuesday. And yeah, again, if you're not following Shy, you should be. Till next time, take care, be well, be kind,